1 year after my wife died, I finally let a contractor open the wall behind her office. I should have done it months earlier. There had been a leak inside the guest bath on the other side of the hall. Not a dramatic leak, just the kind of slow stain men like me ignore because grief turns ordinary maintenance into a kind of insult. Fixing drywall felt obscene when Eleanor was still gone. That Thursday, I was halfway through a stale church luncheon when my phone vibrated in my pocket. The caller ID read Nate Collier, the carpenter I had hired to repair the water damage and replace a section of flooring. Nate was not a nervous man. He had rebuilt half the old porches in our main town and once finished a roof in sleet without saying more than 4 sentences all day. When I answered, his voice was tight enough to make me stand up before he finished the first line. "Mr. Barrett, you need to come home now." I moved away from the folding tables and lemon bars and asked the obvious question. Did the leak get worse? No. A pause. That would have been easier. There are moments when your body knows before your mind does. My stomach went hollow. The fellowship hall was still full of old people politely discussing casseroles and blood pressure. Outside, the parking lot shone with that hard coastal light that makes every chrome bumper look sharper than it is. Everything around me remained ordinary. That made his tone worse. "What did you find?" Nate lowered his voice. "Something built into the wall, deliberate, and I don't think you should tell anybody till you see it. Anybody, not the police, not the insurance company, not your lawyer, anybody." I left my coat on the back of the church chair and drove home without remembering a single stop sign. The house sat exactly where grief had left it. Blue-gray siding, white trim. Eleanor had insisted on repainting every 4 years, even though nobody but her could tell when the old paint had dulled. The garden beds she once kept neat had gone a little wild at the edges. The front porch swing hung still in the windless afternoon. A house only turns into evidence after it has first spent years pretending to be a life. Ours had done that job very well. Eleanor and I bought it when Daniel was 6, and our business was still small enough that one bad lobster season could push us from hopeful to foolish in a month. Back then, the place had a sagging porch, ancient pipes, and windows that rattled in every storm. Eleanor loved it immediately because she trusted potential more than polish. I loved it because the numbers barely worked, and I mistook barely working for destiny if I wanted something badly enough. We built almost everything that mattered inside those walls in plain view. The business first. Barrett Marine Supply started as a cramped storefront near the harbor where I sold rope, tackle, engine parts, foul-weather gear, and whatever else local men swore they urgently needed the night before dawn tide. Eleanor kept the books from a card table in the back room while Daniel colored on invoices and asked why adults bought the same bolts every spring as if winter had eaten them on purpose. Later, when the business grew enough to justify a real office and a second warehouse bay, she brought the books home. That office down the hall became the brain of our marriage. Purchase orders, payroll, tax folders, holiday cards, donation receipts, the world arranged into neat categories by a woman who believed order was not a personality trait, but an act of love. Daniel grew up in that order. He was not a difficult boy. Bright enough, good with his hands, too proud too early, and desperate in the way sons sometimes are for a kind of male certainty fathers accidentally perform, rather than possess. When he was 10, he wanted to go where I went and touch what I touched. By 12, he could tell a starboard cleat from a bow roller. By 16, he moved inventory faster than grown men who had worked with me for years. He laughed less as he got older, which I should have taken as weather and not temperament. But fathers often confuse silent strain for maturity because it flatters our own habits. Richard Hale came into that life when Daniel was 23. My first real business partner had retired and taken his knees and his patients to Florida. Richard appeared through a coastal trade association lunch and seemed made of the exact materials, middle-age mistakes for character. Steady handshake, good suit, moderate opinions delivered in a reassuring tone. He had money, contacts farther south, and the sort of competence that arrives already dressed for a boardroom in towns where most men still think boardrooms are for people who say synergy with a straight face. Eleanor disliked him within 40 minutes, not publicly. She was too disciplined for that. But that night, while peeling potatoes for chowder, she said, "He listens like he's pricing people." I laughed, because I was flattered by the possibility that a man like Richard would price me highly. That is one of the humiliations of age. You discover some of your worst mistakes were made not from greed or lust or even fear, but from being too pleased to be chosen. Richard invested. He advised. He widened our vendor lines. He knew lenders, insurers, harbor board members, 2 city attorneys, and every banker within 50 miles who liked the sound of his own caution. He also knew when to stand back and let me keep the visible authority. That mattered. Men who intend to control another man's life rarely snatch at it early. They stabilize it, improve it, make themselves useful in ways gratitude misfiles as loyalty. Eleanor never fully relaxed around him. She tolerated him at dinner, endured him at holidays, thanked him for wine she never opened. But every now and then she would say something small that I stored and ignored. He asks questions he doesn't need answers to. He notices where we keep the spare key. He compliments the house as if he's measuring it. Little things. Harmless if you want them to be. Mara arrived years later and somehow made Richard seem less singularly dangerous by sharing the work of unease. Daniel met her at a hospital fundraising auction in Portland. She wore black, laughed at the correct volume, and knew exactly how to mirror another person's pace of conversation so that by the third exchange they felt strangely flattered without being able to say why. She told us she had done administrative work in legal offices, some nonprofit coordination, a little event management, and a period in elder care intake that had been emotionally educational, which sounded at the time like the sort of phrase younger people used when they wanted to compress hardship into something cocktail-safe. Eleanor watched her the way harbor captains watch weather that is still technically sunny. The first Christmas Mara spent with us, she offered to help clear dishes before anyone asked. The second, she was the one deciding which leftovers got packed for which relatives. By the third, she had started answering casual questions meant for Daniel. Not all of them, only the ones that involved money, scheduling, stress, or future plans. If I asked Daniel whether he still intended to buy the adjoining lot behind his house, Mara would smile and say they were reviewing debt posture. If Eleanor asked whether they had switched pediatricians for Noah, Mara would say they were keeping continuity in place for now. She used language the way a careful person lays runners over damaged flooring, not to decorate, to direct weight away from weak points. Eleanor saw that immediately. One summer evening after they left, she stood in the kitchen stacking dessert plates and said, "Your son now waits for his own wife to explain him. That is either temporary or expensive." I asked what she meant. She said, "Both kinds cost." I remember it because she turned out to be right in almost every possible direction. By the last year of her life, the household had developed a new choreography without my consent. Richard dropped by more often, but always with a reason. Daniel looked exhausted, but called it scale. Mara knew too much about our accounts by accident, because Daniel supposedly vented. Dr. Vale had become one of those familiar professionals who are no longer seen as outsiders, which is the most dangerous stage of familiarity there is. He could walk through our home discussing blood pressure and supplements, and nobody in the room would remember that he had first arrived attached to Richard and his debts. That was the life the hidden chamber had been built inside. Not a dramatic family, not a loud one, a polite one, a competent one. The kind where dinner still gets served while the structure underneath it rots. Standing in the hallway that afternoon with Nate's flashlight cutting across my dead wife's office, I understood with a fresh kind of humiliation that every ordinary year had apparently contained a second version of itself running underneath. The visible year where we hosted holidays, discussed the marina expansion, bought Noah rain boots, argued over taxes, and took Eleanor to appointments. And the hidden year, the one where Richard priced us. Mara translated us, Vale dosed us, Daniel yielded us. And Eleanor, without telling me, started building a room inside the wall because somewhere before I did, she understood that the truth in our house would need somewhere physical to survive. Nate's truck was angled in the driveway like he had parked quickly and not cared if it looked neat. He met me at the front door before I could take my keys out. Sawdust clung to the knees of his work pants. He had the pale look of a man who had seen something that disturbed him, but embarrassed him too, because disturbing things are supposed to belong to police dramas and not to the homes of decent widowers. "Show me," I said. He nodded and led me down the hall past the framed family photographs I had been unable to move. Eleanor at 50 in her dark green dress, laughing at something just outside the frame. My son Daniel on his college graduation day. Our grandson Noah at age 7, missing 2 front teeth and still somehow managing to look skeptical about being photographed. Then Nate pushed open the door to Eleanor's office. I had not entered that room more than twice since her funeral. The office had once been her sanctuary. Eleanor ran the books for our marine supply business from that desk and somehow made profit and loss statements look like something a civilized person might care about. She kept the curtains half open, a lamp on even in daylight, and a ceramic bowl of peppermints for customers who almost never came back that far into the house. I still associated the room with the smell of paper, lavender hand cream, and the soft scratch of her pen. Now the room looked gutted. The carpet by the far wall had been pulled up in a square. Plaster dust coated the baseboard. Studs showed where drywall should have been, and where the wall ought to have held nothing but insulation and old pipes, there was a recess, a cavity, a narrow hidden chamber about the width of a closet, framed between Eleanor's office and the bathroom wall behind it. Nate lifted his flashlight and pointed into the dark gap. "I found the leak line behind there," he said. "Had to cut farther than I expected. Then I saw this," he swallowed, "and that." In the rear of the chamber, embedded behind a false board, sat a black safe about the size of a microwave. The shelf above it held a small stack of banker's boxes wrapped in plastic. On the floor was a stool, not construction debris. A real stool, something somebody had placed there to use. I stared without speaking. The house had been mine and Eleanor's for 37 years. We had raised our son in it. We had buried 2 dogs from it, refinished the floors together, argued about roof shingles, painted bedrooms, weathered layoffs, paid off the mortgage, and hosted more Thanksgiving dinners than I could count. And somewhere in the middle of that life, my wife had hidden a room inside the wall and never told me. Nate stepped back. "I didn't touch the safe," he said. "Didn't open the boxes. This felt like the kind of thing a man ought to see with his own eyes. The truth is, my first feeling was not fear. It was injury. A stupid, immediate, selfish injury. What had Eleanor needed to hide from me? Then I saw dust marks on the floor of the chamber, smudged arcs, a partial boot print. Somebody had been there before Nate, recently enough to disturb the fine plaster powder, but not recently enough to leave wet mud. Nate saw me notice it. "I was going to say," he murmured, "I don't think I'm the first one to find it." That was when my phone buzzed. Daniel. My son's name lit the screen. I let it ring out, not because I knew anything yet, because in that moment I understood only one thing clearly. If Eleanor had gone to the trouble of building a room inside her wall, and if someone had already been inside it after her death, then I had spent the last year mourning a woman whose last months I had not understood at all. The safe opened with the code of our wedding anniversary. I hated that fact immediately, not because it was sentimental, because it meant she had expected me to find it eventually. Inside were 4 folders, 1 digital recorder, a flash drive, and a cream journal with the elastic strap wrapped twice around it. The folder tabs were labeled in Eleanor's hand. Daniel, Mara, Dr. Stephen Vale, Richard Hale, my son, my daughter-in-law, our family physician, my closest friend and longtime business partner. For a few seconds after reading those 4 folder tabs, my mind refused to arrange them into a shape. It treated them like a bad list someone had drafted from the wrong life. Daniel I could understand as a possibility, though not yet as a reality. Sons disappoint, sons drift, sons borrow, delay, evade, panic, and tell themselves next quarter will repair last quarter. Fathers are built with enough vanity to believe our own boys will do all that in some familiar register we can still translate back into innocence if given time. Mara belonged in the category of strategic discomfort. I had disliked parts of her for years without ever giving myself permission to call the dislike knowledge. She was too polished in the moments where most people accidentally reveal confusion or fatigue. She held a room the way accountants hold a pen, lightly but with intent. She had once asked me over pot roast whether my retirement planning had protective flexibility, and when I answered vaguely, she nodded as though my own uncertainty were useful to file. Even then, the question had left a residue on me. Men of my age are used to being asked how they are, not what structures might survive them. Dr. Stephen Vale was harder because physicians live partly inside surrender. You hand them your arm for blood pressure, your wife's medication list, your fear phrased as a symptom. They enter the home carrying professional shorthand and leave with portions of your life. No ordinary man is ever allowed to inventory. Vale had attended Eleanor's funeral. He had stood beside me at the church hall and touched my elbow with exactly the right amount of solemnity. He had used the phrase massive event in that soft, flattened tone doctors use when they want you to stop thinking in pictures. Looking at his name in that folder, I felt a different kind of nausea than the one Richard inspired. Betrayal by a friend still belongs to the language of character. Betrayal by a physician stains the language itself. And then Richard. I had known Richard Hale 29 years. That is long enough to bury your caution under accumulated proof of weathered loyalty, long enough to have stood beside a man in hospital corridors, licensing board meetings, and one unforgettable August storm where we spent 6 hours moving inventory above floodline, with rain coming sideways through broken loading bay glass. Long enough that the word friend, once used often enough in public, begins acting on the mind like documentation. You stop checking it. Stop asking what it rests on. Stop noticing that some men are at ease in every room because all rooms are ultimately inventory to them. Richard was godfather to Daniel in every way except church record. He taught the boy to shake hands with eye contact, let him sit on high stools in offices where real money moved, and once gave him a graduation watch so expensive Eleanor and I argued privately afterward about whether accepting it had quietly obligated us to something we could not yet see. Richard made a habit of generosity precise enough to feel gracious and large enough to be remembered. If he paid for marina dinner after a successful quarter, he did not mention it again. If he leaned on a lender for us, he did it as though helping us was merely how competent men move through the world. Looking back, I can see the shape of the lesson he had been teaching all along. Debt feels kinder when it arrives dressed as relief. I sat there in the hidden chamber with those names in my lap, and memories rising around each one like contaminated water. Daniel at 14 on the docks, sunburned nose, asking Richard whether confidence was something you could learn if you were not born with it. Mara at Eleanor's birthday brunch, offering to reorganize our medication drawer because systems reduce stress. Vale in my kitchen, looking over Eleanor's supplement bottles with a physician's board authority while Richard topped off his drink. Richard himself at Christmas, watching the rest of us open gifts with that same faintly detached satisfaction I had once mistaken for mature affection. If a stranger had brought me those 4 names in an envelope and said, "Build me the ugliest possible version of your life from these," I might still not have reached what actually happened. Grief had made me slower, yes, but it had not made me stupid enough to imagine coordinated ruin inside my own family. That kind of thing belongs to documentaries and criminal indictments, not to the people who know what brand of tea your wife drinks or which knot your grandson cannot tie yet on his own. My first impulse was to start saying no out loud. No, not Daniel. No, not Eleanor's doctor. No, not after 30 years with Richard. No, not under my own roof. Denial in older men rarely looks dramatic. It looks procedural. A desire to check one more file, reread one more line, wait for one clean contradiction big enough to let the heart go back to its easier duties. But the hidden room would not permit that. The stool, the safe, the banker's boxes wrapped against moisture, the journal dated and updated over months, the disturbed dust on the floor where someone else had already come hunting. My wife had not panicked once and scribbled accusations in a fever. She had built storage for evidence inside the house and prepared for me to reach it after she was gone. That level of method leaves no room for my preferred version of reality. I remember gripping the folder labeled Richard and thinking of a dinner years earlier when Eleanor had asked him, lightly enough to sound joking, whether he ever got tired of being useful to everyone. He had smiled over his wine and said, "Useful men get to stay close to the table." At the time it had sounded like worldly charm. Sitting in the wall with his name in my lap, it sounded like doctrine. Nate knocked softly on the office door then and asked if I needed water. I almost laughed. Water. As if this were heat exhaustion. As if my wife had not just reached a hand through the dark and informed me that the 4 people closest to my remaining life might already be measuring what was left of it for division. No, I said. Then, after a second, actually yes, because shock, like dignity, is easier to endure when somebody hands you something ordinary and expects you to keep sitting upright. I sat down on the stool in the hidden chamber because my legs had suddenly become less reliable than my pride. Nate, who understood enough not to linger over another man's shock, quietly moved back into the office and shut the door most of the way. I opened the journal first. Eleanor had dated every entry. That was her way. She did not write to process. She wrote to preserve. Grocery totals, meeting notes, things said by people who thought they would not later be asked to repeat them. If there was a journal in a safe, it was not there because she had become poetic in grief. It was evidence. The first entry that mattered was dated 14 months before her death. Daniel has started moving money without telling Arthur. Says it's temporary. Richard told him he can smooth it out by quarter close. I do not believe either of them. I read that line 3 times. Arthur was me. My wife had apparently started referring to me in her own private notes, like a man who needed protection from the truth. The next entry that mattered came 2 months later. Mara knows too much about incapacity filings for a woman who claims she only did administrative work at Mercer and Rowe. She keeps using language normal wives do not use. Compliance, threshold, capacity. That is not casual speech. I turned pages faster. There were notes on invoices, dates of transfers, questions. Eleanor had apparently asked herself out loud when she no longer trusted the answers given by the people around us. Then an entry from the winter before she died. My vitamins taste metallic. Vale says it is the coating. Richard said I worry too much. Easy for him. He is not losing his hair in the shower. I stopped. Dr. Stephen Vale had been our doctor for 12 years. He shook Daniel's hand at graduation parties, sent flowers when Eleanor's sister died, took my blood pressure while discussing halibut season and Red Sox pitching. Richard had introduced him to us over golf. I turned another page. If I am right, then Richard did not bring Vale into our lives by accident. That was the moment the room stopped being a secret and became a crime scene. I read until the handwriting began to fail. Eleanor's pen strokes, always neat and slanted, started to wobble in the final months. Words drifted uphill. Letters pressed too hard in one line and vanished in the next. Under ordinary circumstances, I might have taken that for weakness and nothing more. In the context of the journal, it looked like a woman racing impairment she no longer believed was natural. Near the end, she wrote, "If anything happens to me before March, do not accept any explanation from Richard without checking dates against my folders." Then, Mara smiled today when I asked why Daniel now lets her answer every difficult question. It was not a frightened smile, it was a trained one. And then, just 9 days before Eleanor died, if Arthur is reading this, I waited too long. I thought I needed certainty. What I really needed was time, and that is the one thing they have been taking. My throat closed. I had known my wife as practical, difficult to flatter, impossible to rush, and utterly uninterested in melodrama. She would not have written like this unless terror had become measurable. I set the journal on my knee and picked up the digital recorder. The file list held a single track. She had named it for me. A, not Arthur, not husband, just A. I pressed play. There was static first, then a scrape, a breath, and Eleanor's voice. Not the public voice she used at vendor lunches or holiday dinners, the smaller one. The one she used after midnight when she was too tired to protect me from what she thought and loved me enough to try anyway. "Arthur, if you found this, then either I was wrong and I made a fool of myself, or I was right and I ran out of time." My hands shook so badly I had to brace the recorder against the safe door. She continued, slower than usual, as though choosing words through a fog. "Daniel has been taking direction from Richard for over a year. At first I thought it was business, then I thought it was debt. Now I think it is leverage. Richard has something on him, or over him, or has made him so dependent that the difference no longer matters." The recording hissed, a cough. Then, "Mara is not what she says she is. Check her prior names. Check Pennsylvania and Connecticut. There are guardianship filings. Men who lost authority quickly. One died, one disappeared into a private facility long enough to sign everything he owned away before he emerged angry and unprovable." I closed my eyes. No man wants to hear his wife calmly connect his family to patterns like that. Not because disbelief is strong, because belief is worse. On the recording, Eleanor lowered her voice further. "Dr. Vale is helping them. I cannot prove whether he started this or merely agreed to it, but he is altering my medication. If I tell him I know, he will deny it and call me anxious. If I tell Richard I know, he will become kind, which is much more dangerous." Another pause. "If I die suddenly, look at my blood work history. Look at who ordered changes and who picked up the prescriptions. Do not let Daniel speak for me. And Arthur," she inhaled sharply as if the effort cost her, "if they move quickly after I die, it means they were already prepared." The recording ended with one final sound I wish it had not preserved. A chair scraping violently against the floor, as though she had heard someone coming. I listened twice, then a third time. By the third listen, one sentence had lodged in me like grit under the skin. "If they move quickly after I die, it means they were already prepared." Eleanor had officially died of a severe stroke at home just after noon on a Wednesday. Dr. Vale had signed off on the cause with almost indecent efficiency. Richard had arrived before the second ambulance. Mara had taken over the kitchen before sunset and told people which dishes to use for coffee. Daniel had looked wrecked, but he had not seemed surprised by logistics. Everyone around me had moved in a smooth, ugly rhythm while I stood in the middle of the day thinking the floor had dissolved under my feet. Prepared. I listened to the recording 3 times before I trusted my own hands enough to touch the folders again. The first time I heard only absence. Not words. Not facts. Absence. Eleanor had been dead a year, and yet there she was in my hand, breathing between sentences, pausing to choose precision over panic like she always had. People who have not lost a spouse in that way think recordings bring comfort. They do not. Not at first. They bring physics, the exact speed of a breath, the slight roughness in the throat. The way a familiar voice lands on your nervous system with so much certainty that the body starts looking around for the person it belongs to. The second time I heard fear. Not hysteria. Eleanor did not frighten theatrically. She frightened by becoming narrower, quieter, more deliberate. In the recording she spoke as if every unnecessary word might cost her something. She described the metallic taste, the fatigue, the hair in the shower drain, and Richard's sudden habit of answering practical questions before I could. She said Daniel had become strangely partitioned, by which she meant he still loved us in visible gestures, but had begun moving around some growing internal chamber where he no longer let either of us stand. She said Mara treated our household like a problem set. She said Vale never looked directly at her when she asked simple questions in the most direct possible language. Then she said something that made me stop the recording and sit very still in the dust. Arthur still believes proximity means loyalty. I must have said that line back out loud after hearing it, because Nate later told me he heard my voice through the office door and thought for a second another person had entered the room. She was right, of course. It is one of the less flattering truths about me. I am good with repeated presence, good with weathering alongside someone. Good with labor and routine, and the long accumulation of shared history that usually builds trust honestly. I had always thought that made me steady. It did. It also made me vulnerable to a very specific kind of person. The kind who understands that if he shows up often enough at your hospital bed, your loading dock, your holiday table, and your bad month, he can become part of your sense of structure without ever becoming part of your conscience. The third listen was the worst because then I heard sequence. That is what Eleanor had really left me. Not just fear, order. She listed dates, the medication adjustment before the collapse, the transfer requests before the paperwork language, the way Mara had started casually asking whether I understood our own trusts, the way Richard visited more often the moment Eleanor grew weaker, the day Vale told her some symptoms were not uncommon in women your age. A phrase so professionally lazy, she repeated it in the recording with naked contempt. The fact that Daniel had once tried to say something in the driveway and Mara had come outside before he finished the sentence. Then she gave me one memory I had not known she possessed. Richard thinks in windows, she said. Not time, windows. He waits for people to become administratively vulnerable. Sickness, debt, grief, confusion. If I am right, he has already chosen the next one. That next one was me. There is a peculiar shame in understanding that your dead wife spent her last clear months trying to construct a bridge back to you because she no longer trusted the living men around her to tell the truth without permission. I thought of the day she died. I had left the house at 9 because there was a dispute at the warehouse over an engine shipment, and one of our younger staff had sent 3 texts in a row, which in our line of work usually means either theft or stupidity. Eleanor had looked pale at breakfast, but still mocked me for over-toasting the bread. Richard called at 10:51 saying I should come home because something's happened. By the time I got there, Vale was already in the kitchen with his coat off. Richard met me in the drive. Mara somehow had Noah out of the house before I even asked where he was. Daniel kept saying, "Dad, sit down," as if gravity itself might improve the information. At the time, the whole day felt like catastrophe. Listening to Eleanor's voice in the wall, it rearranged itself into preparedness. Richard there too early, Vale there too smoothly. Mara moving like logistics had been rehearsed. Daniel shattered, yes, but not entirely surprised by the choreography. I have gone over that Wednesday more times than is useful. Memory is a cruel editor. Once you know where to look, every tiny thing seems loaded with destiny. Perhaps some of that is hindsight dressing itself as insight. But not all. Not when a dying woman leaves you a timeline and then dies exactly inside the rhythm she feared. At the very end of the recording, Eleanor stopped sounding afraid and started sounding angry. That was harder to hear than fear. "If they move quickly after I die," she said, "it means they were already prepared. Do not let grief make you passive on their behalf. They will count on your decency because they mistake it for softness. It is not soft to delay them. Delay them." That word mattered more than anything else on the tape. Not punish, not avenge, delay. Eleanor understood something I still had to grow into over the following weeks. People who build control structures often depend less on brilliance than on tempo. They do not need you to agree with them. They need you to stay emotionally slow while they become administratively fast. By the time the recording clicked off, my hand had cramped around the little device hard enough to leave red pressure marks across the base of my fingers. Nate opened the office door just enough to slide the glass of water onto the desk. He took one look at my face and did not ask what I had heard. "There's fresh batteries in my truck if you need power for anything," he said. That absurdly practical offer nearly undid me more than sympathy would have. I nodded. Then I said, "Nate, if anybody asks, you found the leak and nothing else." He studied me for a second. Then he said, "I can do that." Not because he understood everything. Because he understood enough. Prepared. That single word from the recording kept circling in my head. Prepared for her death. Prepared for my grief. Prepared for a doctor's certificate, a son's shame, a daughter-in-law's forms, a friend's controlling patience. Prepared for me to remain the husband who trusted proximity more than sequence. Eleanor had left me the only thing she still could, a chance to become inconvenient before they finished the rest. I opened the folders. Daniel's file held copies of transfers from our marine supply company to shell entities I had never heard of. A marina restoration fund, a parts sourcing partnership, consulting fees, All of it looked respectable until you noticed the same two mailing addresses appearing under different names. Eleanor had circled them in red. Mara's folder contained printouts of old filings under two prior surnames: a marriage in New Haven, a separation in Pittsburgh. Petition language from an elder incapacity case in Hartford. Some of the pages were harder to read because Eleanor had clearly printed them from public terminals or poor scans, but the pattern was there. Professional vocabulary around decline, swift court action, spouses who became temporarily unable to manage affairs, assets transferred into protective structures, the sort of paperwork honest people never see because they never need to. Vale's file held prescription summaries, dosage changes, and several pages where Eleanor had written side-by-side comparisons in the margins. Hair thinning began after dosage shift, metallic taste after refill, confusion after nighttime tablet increase. Richard's file was thickest. Business registrations, loan documents, personal guarantees. A photograph from college I had not seen in 40 years. Eleanor and Richard at a winter formal, her hand on his sleeve. His face angled toward her in a way I recognized at once and hated for waiting this long to notice. When I turned the photograph over, there was a note in Eleanor's writing. He never stopped being angry that I married you. I sat in that hidden room until the light outside shifted, and Nate eventually tapped the office door to tell me he was leaving. I paid him in cash with a gratuity large enough to purchase his silence, if not his peace. And I told him the discovery related to family matters I would handle privately for the moment. He studied my face, saw enough truth in it to stop asking questions, and left. That night, Daniel and Mara came by with soup. Soup. I heard their car in the driveway while I was still standing in Eleanor's office trying to return things to the safe exactly as I had found them. My son called through the front door with the false warmth adult children use when they have already decided their parent is frailer than he knows. "Dad, we brought dinner." Mara entered first, carrying the casserole dish and wearing concern like tailored clothing. They had been checking on me twice a week for months. At the time, I had called it kindness. After the safe, I saw it for what it was: monitoring, temperature taking, a routine built to make access feel loving. "Long day?" Daniel asked. "Contractor found the leak?" Mara added too quickly. I looked at her. The fastest way to scare clever people is not accusation, it is stillness. "Small problem," I said. Mara set the soup down. Her eyes flicked toward the hall, toward Eleanor's office, then back to my face. Daniel saw the movement and covered his own with an exaggerated sigh. "You should let me handle repairs," he said. "You've had enough to manage." There it was, the beginning of their favorite music. "Let us handle it. You've had enough. You shouldn't have to think about all this." I told them I was tired. I accepted the soup. Then I watched them while they tried not to search my house with their eyes. Mara eventually brought up estate updates. Gently, carefully, practically. "Arthur, now that a year is almost approaching, have you thought any more about simplifying things? Just while you're still grieving and it all feels heavy?" My wife had been dead 11 months, still grieving, as if grief were a temporary disability with a paperwork window. Daniel cut in. "We don't want you overwhelmed." Of course he did not say. "We want legal access before you look too closely at anything your wife left behind." Mara touched my forearm. "We just want to protect you." I looked at my son, really looked at him. He had my nose, Eleanor's eyes, and the kind of exhausted face men wear when they have let compromise become identity. I searched for remorse and found only strain. That shook me more than villainy would have. Villains are easier to hate cleanly. A son under pressure can still tell himself he is only helping the bad people manage the necessary parts. I asked them one question. "When did Richard last speak to you?" Daniel froze for a fraction of a second too long. "Earlier," he said. That answer was enough. The safe had been opened before Nate found it. My son knew. My daughter-in-law suspected how much I knew. Richard was already moving. After they left, I checked the living room lamp Eleanor had always hated. Inside the base, behind the felt pad, a tiny camera lens looked back at me. Warm, active. Someone had given me surveillance as a Christmas gift, and I had thanked them for it. The next morning, I called the one person in town who disliked Richard Hale enough to think clearly. Lydia Mercer had been Eleanor's college roommate, my occasional legal advisor, and the kind of attorney who dressed like a librarian but gutted liars for a living. She had spent 28 years in trusts, elder law, and probate disputes, which meant she understood exactly how respectable evil could look once stamped, notarized, and filed. She arrived by 10 with 2 legal pads, no patience, and a thermos of her own coffee because she considered mine undrinkable on principle. I told her everything. Not the softened version. Not the version husbands tell when they are still ashamed they missed obvious things. Everything. The hidden room, the journal, the recorder, the camera in the lamp, the folders, the transfers, Mara's old filings. Vale's prescriptions, Richard's photograph, Daniel's hesitation, the fact that my wife had apparently died while documenting the people around her. Lydia listened without interruption, which was worse than gasping would have been. When I finished, she walked the house with me, checked the office, examined the safe contents, held the college photograph by its corners like it smelled bad, took notes while replaying Eleanor's recording twice. Then she asked the question I had not wanted to hear. Do you still trust your son enough to be surprised by him? I stared at her. No, I said finally. Good, that's useful. She pointed at the lamp camera. Do not remove it yet. I wasn't going to. You looked like you wanted to smash it. I did, she nodded. Anger is fine. Evidence is better. We spent the afternoon cataloging everything Eleanor had left. Lydia thought in layers. Criminal exposure, civil exposure, control exposure. She circled the transfers first. This is not someone stealing to live prettier, she said. This is a structure. Your money moved with purpose. Then Mara's old filings. This woman has done some version of this before. Maybe not all the way to confinement. Maybe only around capacity pressure and managed consent. But the language is the same. Then Vale's notes. He's either negligent enough to lose his license twice over or complicit enough to start checking prison sentencing guidelines. Finally, Richard. She tapped the photo of Eleanor and Richard at college. This is not motive by itself. No. But, she met my eyes, but obsession often looks like patience once enough years pass. Lydia made 3 calls before leaving my kitchen. One to a forensic accountant she trusted. One to a private investigator retired from state police. One to a probate judge's former clerk who owed her a favor and knew how to quietly check whether anyone had begun drafting incapacity paperwork involving my name. The answer to that last question came first. At 4:16, she called back. They have not filed yet, she said, but someone requested preliminary guardianship packet language through a private office last month. My scalp went cold. Who? Law office in Portland that does emergency incapacity petitions and protective estate transfers. The request came through a staff account linked to Mara. Not filed yet, which meant they were preparing to decide when. That evening, the private investigator arrived. His name was Warren Kells. 61, former financial crimes unit, face like an old shovel, voice permanently unimpressed. He took one look at the journal and recorder and said, Your wife was either the sharpest woman in Maine or the unluckiest, possibly both. I liked him immediately. Warren started where practical men start. Warren's first real gift was not intelligence. It was contempt. Not for me, for vagueness. He hated soft language with the kind of professional disgust only people from fraud units and probate courts ever really perfect. If I said Daniel had been off lately, Warren asked whether off meant missing meetings, hiding debt, changing routines, or suddenly becoming interested in inheritance structures he could not previously spell. If Lydia said Mara had prior exposure to protective filings, Warren wanted the county, the firm, the supervising attorney, and whether the case involved capacity, conservatorship, or emergency transfer authority. He did not let anybody grieve in adjectives. That helped. By 10 that night, my dining room table looked less like a home and more like the unrolled guts of a long con. Warren sorted documents into lanes. Money lane, medical lane, access lane, timing lane. Every record Eleanor had saved went somewhere. Every text thread, scanned invoice, prescription summary, and public filing got indexed by sequence. He wrote dates on index cards and lined them across the runner. Eleanor used to insist was too nice for ordinary meals, even though all our meals had been ordinary and that was supposed to be the point. Then he started asking about the business, not the current numbers, the emotional structure of it, who trusted whom, who signed what, who was allowed to move vendor money when I traveled. Which staff considered Richard the real authority in practice, even when my name remained on paper. Whether Daniel's title had grown faster than his competence or slower than his pride. Whether Eleanor ever complained that Richard helped by being CC'd on things he had no real need to see. Those questions mapped something I had not previously thought to describe. Richard had never tried to take my business in public. He had trained it to orbit him in private. He solved lender problems before I felt them, smoothed seasonal shortages, talked Daniel through expansion ideas I did not fully understand because I had built the company from inventory and relationships rather than leverage instruments and cost spread models. He made modernity feel like assistance. By the time Eleanor started suspecting him, half our higher-level financial conversation already passed through channels he had either introduced or normalized. Warren did not look surprised by any of that. Predators love modernization, he said while highlighting a routing number. You can hide theft better in progress than in decay. Nobody asks questions when the paperwork gets fancier. Around midnight, he found the first thing that made him stop talking entirely. Two shell entities receiving Daniel's transfers shared not just mailing links but secondary officer history with a holding company Richard had once used in a marina redevelopment dispute up north. Different names on top, same skeleton underneath, the kind of skeleton only repetition creates. Lydia leaned over the table. How buried? Enough that a local banker misses it, Warren said. Not enough that a man who spent 22 years staring at fake asset partitions misses it. Then he looked at me. Your son didn't build this. I had known that already in my bones. Hearing it aloud still changed something, because it moved Daniel, however slightly, out of mastermind territory and back into a worse but more familiar category. Weakness useful to someone stronger. Warren kept digging. By 1:30 he had pulled 3 old court dockets involving elder exploitation language that matched phrases Eleanor had underlined in Mara's folder. Threshold decline, supported compliance, temporary protective control. Those phrases sound harmless if you encounter them in a safe room with trustable people. In the wrong hands, they become solvents, enough to blur autonomy until a frightened judge, bank, or physician decides overreach is prudence. Mara, according to Warren's preliminary sweep, had not been some casual admin who once handled filing cabinets. She had spent 18 months at a Hartford office that specialized in emergency incapacity petitions, spousal asset protection, and high-friction family transitions, which is the kind of phrase law firms invent when admitting what they do out loud would get the receptionist struck by God. One of those cases had collapsed under review. Another settled quietly. In a third, an older man regained control of his accounts after his wife's petition turned out to rest on contradictory medical affidavits. No charges? I asked. Not that stuck, Warren said. People don't like criminalizing family unless the blood is still wet. The sentence landed ugly and true. Families get away with astonishing things because institutions fear the mess of intervening before the damage becomes visible enough to photograph. At 2 a.m, Denise Moreland joined us by secure call from Bangor. Lydia trusted her because Denise had once testified against her own brother in a tax shelter fraud case and then still sent him soup when he got cancer. That is the kind of moral architecture I prefer in experts. Denise took one look at our scanned ledgers and said, "Whoever designed this assumed older owners forgive irregularity if it arrives dressed as temporary strain." "Can you prove diversion?" Lydia asked. Denise smiled without warmth. "Give me 48 hours and clean export access. I can probably prove choreography." Choreography. That word fit the whole thing. Transfers not as theft alone, but as a dance step. Medication not as medicine alone, but as tempo control. Family dinners not as affection, but as atmosphere management. The business not as work, but as cover. Warren found one more thing before dawn that I have never entirely gotten over. A set of archived emails from 7 years earlier, when Richard first pushed the idea of de-risking succession volatility. That was his phrase. He wrote it to Daniel after a meeting neither Eleanor nor I had been invited to. The email itself was harmless enough in isolation, but attached to it, misfiled in a server backup Aaron later helped recover, was a note Richard had apparently intended only for himself or one of his private structures. Barrett family dynamic remains simple if pressure enters from the son side first. Father yields slower under threat than under rescue. I read that line 3 times, not because I failed to understand it, because I understood it immediately and still wanted one more chance to be wrong. Pressure enters from the son side first. That had been the whole design. Daniel in debt, Daniel ashamed, Daniel dependent on Richard's guidance, then Mara attached to Daniel, then Eleanor weakened, then Vale proximate, then me last, because fathers are most easily isolated once sons are compromised and wives are dying. By morning we had enough to replace my raw panic with something more durable. Anger with map coordinates. That does not make a man calmer. It makes him more dangerous if he can stand not moving too soon. Warren packed his notes into a hard case and stood by the kitchen sink, drinking the last of Lydia's good coffee. "You have one advantage," he said, "which is, they still think grief is the biggest thing in the room." He was right. They thought I was slow because I loved my wife, soft because I loved my son, predictable because men like me usually are. The sun was coming up over the harbor when Warren left. The windows over Eleanor's office had gone pale. The house looked tired and older than it had the day before, as if truth itself had weight and had spent the night moving through the walls. Lydia put a hand on the back of one chair and said, "Get 2 hours of sleep if you can." I said, "I don't think I can." She answered, "I know. Lie down anyway. Exhaustion makes decent men honest at the wrong time." That was how the next phase began. Not with police tape, not with revelation, with professionals teaching me how to stay impolite enough to survive my own family. Money, movement, timelines. By midnight, he had already found that 2 of the shell entities receiving Daniel's transfers routed through an LLC connected to a condo purchased 18 months earlier in New Hampshire. The condo was not in Richard's name. It was held by a trust. The trust's mailing contact led to Dr. Vale's office suite. That bothered even Warren. Doctors are supposed to hide bad news, he said, not real estate. The next day, he dug deeper into Mara. Her first marriage ended after her husband signed over authority to manage certain accounts during what records described as an acute period of mental instability. The court later reversed portions of the arrangement, but only after most of the money had already been repositioned. The second case was uglier. Not murder on paper ugly. Just the kind of administrative fog where a man disappeared into a private recovery center long enough for his ex-wife to liquidate a shared property interest and call it necessary. The most corrosive part was how boring it all looked on record. No blood, no masks, no gothic music, just forms, dates, professional language. By the third evening, we knew more than I had wanted to know, and less than I needed to prove anything cleanly. Then Daniel made the first move. He called while Warren and Lydia sat across from me at the dining table reviewing notes. "Dad," he said too casually, "Richard suggested we all have Sunday dinner. Just family. You, me, Mara, Richard. It might be good for everyone." Lydia raised one eyebrow without speaking. I asked the only question that mattered. "Why now?" Daniel exhaled. "Because things feel tense." Tense. There it was again. One of those bloodless little words people use when the truth underneath would sound too ugly aloud. I told him I'd think about it. After I hung up, Warren leaned back. "They know the safe was opened." "How?" He pointed toward the living room. "Because the camera stopped giving them a grieving widower and started giving them a man who walks differently." He was right. The problem with fear is that once it hardens into purpose, your body stops performing innocence the same way. That night we searched the house properly and found 2 more devices. One under the kitchen credenza, one in the hallway smoke detector, 3 cameras, no alarms, no obvious external monitoring hardware, remote feed. Daniel and Mara had not just been checking on me. They had been watching how I sat, ate, paced, drank, and slept inside my own home. Warren called it what it was. Pre-incapacity surveillance. They're collecting behavior, maybe to use, maybe just to understand when you're easiest. Lydia sat very still for a long moment, then said, "Arthur, from this minute forward, you no longer live in the emotional version of your life. You live in the evidentiary one." I remember that sentence because it took what had still felt like betrayal and turned it into terrain. Not home, not family, terrain. We set the first trap on Friday. I agreed to Sunday dinner. Then I spent the next 48 hours pretending to unravel. I left the back gate open, forgot to shave. Bought whiskey I did not drink and left the empty bottle visible in recycling. Called Daniel once and asked the same question twice. Told Mara I had found one of Eleanor's old budgeting ledgers and could not make sense of all the numbers. If they were collecting weakness, I gave them curation. Warren watched the camera feeds in real time through a cloned signal setup. Aaron Bell, one of Lydia's younger tech contractors, rigged from the basement. "Richard watched that one," Aaron said at one point, pointing to the living room feed access pattern. "Long session, over 20 minutes. He's not just checking in, he's studying." Of course he was. Obsessive men who believe they are about to win rarely hurry the looking. Sunday dinner began with braised lamb and lies. Before the first direct move, they spent nearly 20 minutes calibrating me. That is the word for it. Not comforting, not checking in, calibrating. Richard asked whether I had remembered to pay the fuel supplier on Wednesday, then apologized with practiced warmth when I hesitated before answering. Mara mentioned that Noah had been asking after me, and then watched to see whether my face brightened enough to suggest leverage still worked through the child. Daniel asked if I was getting any sleep at all, but phrased it the way a man asks whether a machine has started making noise. Vale was not there yet in body, but his influence sat at the table through every reference to rest, stress, confusion, and how grief rewires executive function in men my age. I gave them what Lydia had told me to give, a little too much pause before names. One repeated question about whether Noah still liked the Science Museum, a false start in a story about Eleanor that ended in me staring too long at my own plate, the sort of behavior that in ordinary people would be read as sorrow. In Predators, it gets read as readiness. Mara did most of the field work. She had changed since the funeral, not visibly harsher, cleaner, more compressed. She dressed like someone expecting institutional sympathy if needed. Cream sweater, small earrings, no perfume strong enough to be remembered by deputies later if things went badly. When she spoke, she lowered her voice half a note below warmth, professional grief, managed affection, the exact tone one uses when trying to guide a patient, a donor, or an elderly witness toward the sentence already waiting for them. "Arthur," she said at one point, "have you had anyone help you sort Eleanor's accounts yet?" I cut the lamb and took my time answering. "Not really. That must be overwhelming." "It's arithmetic," I said, Not weather. She smiled as if I had said something charmingly old-fashioned. Sometimes arithmetic is weather. That line would have sounded wise to anyone hearing it outside context. At the table it landed like a probe. Would I resist metaphor? Would I accept being translated? Would I let her move me from personhood into condition? Richard watched all of it over the rim of his glass. He did not need to speak often because the room had already learned him. Daniel straightened slightly whenever Richard turned his head. Mara adjusted tempo when Richard slowed his fork. Even the silence after certain comments belonged more to him than to the house. That was the thing I had missed for years. Richard did not dominate loudly. He set rhythm and let weaker people mistake their obedience for agreement. Daniel looked terrible in a way that angered me because some part of me still wanted his visible suffering to matter morally. He had lost weight. His beard line had gone uneven. The skin under his eyes had the bruised exhaustion of a man who either was not sleeping or did not deserve to. More than once, he started to say something and stopped when Mara's hand came to rest lightly against the stem of her water glass. Not touching him. Never anything that obvious. Just enough movement to remind him she was there, and that the version of the evening he could survive had already been chosen. Noah was absent. Mara said he had a classmate's birthday dinner. I knew immediately it was a lie. Not because she could not lie cleanly, because she had chosen a child-related excuse too quickly and over-explained the gift bag, the bowling alley, the late pickup, and how normalcy is good for children during extended family loss cycles. Nobody who has ever taken a child to a birthday party in rural Maine says extended family loss cycles unless they are trying to make the sentence sound like somebody else's authority. Noah had been moved off the board for a reason. Either because they feared what he might say in front of me, or because they did not want one innocent witness in the room while the adults began positioning the cage. At one point I excused myself to the downstairs bathroom and left my phone face down near the butter dish, exactly where Aaron told me to. They needed line of sight on me, and I needed them to think I was too far inside my own head to protect even obvious things. On the way back, I paused in the hallway just long enough to hear my own son whisper, "Maybe not tonight." Mara answered first. If not tonight, then when? Then Richard, lower than both of them. Tonight is ideal because he is still pliable. We do not improve our odds by waiting. Pliable. There are words a man does not forget once he hears them applied to himself like material. I returned to the dining room carrying my old face and sat down as if I had heard nothing. Richard gave me a look I knew well from vendor negotiations, the one that asked whether the field had shifted while he was not watching it directly. "Everything all right?" he said. "Plumbing's loud," I answered, not clever, useful. He relaxed slightly because ordinary complaints comfort predatory people. They like to hear a target still discussing household nuisance while they prepare structural theft. Mara reached for the breadbasket and set it closer to me. "You should eat more," she said. "I'm eating." "Not enough." "How can you tell?" she smiled, because Eleanor would have said the same thing. That was a good line. Cruel, too. Borrowed intimacy always is. I looked at her for a long second and let just enough grief show to make her think she had landed the emotional blade where she meant to. Then I said, "Eleanor also used to say people become very generous with another person's life once they've stopped seeing it as a life." That silenced Daniel outright. Richard came to his rescue fast. "What she means," he said smoothly, "is that we're trying to help you through the administrative fog." Administrative fog. Another beautiful little phrase from men who need confusion to sound environmental rather than engineered. I asked, "Is that what we're calling it now?" He held my gaze. "It is what courts, banks, and insurers call it when paperwork gets delayed because someone is emotionally compromised." There it was again. Not overt threat. Infrastructure. He wanted me hearing institutions long before any deputy did. I nodded, as if the phrase had tired me more than alarmed me. Then I reached for the salt and deliberately spilled some across the placemat. A stupid little move. Useful, because small incompetence comforts ambitious thieves even more than sorrow does. Mara moved immediately to help. Daniel half rose. Richard did not. He just watched. That told me something too. The man who really believed I was unraveling would have helped from habit. The man hoping I was unraveling studies first. I dabbed at the salt with the napkin and said, "Hands aren't what they were." Mara said softly, "That happens." "No, it gets arranged," but I only nodded. By the time she finally slid the folder beside my plate, the room had been prepared exactly the way they wanted. Enough concern already spoken that documents could masquerade as care. Enough subtle medical vocabulary in the air that oversight sounded like mercy. Enough family language that any later resistance of mine could be described as grief-driven paranoia rather than simple human self-defense. That was why the folder mattered so much. Not because it contained the worst thing they wanted, Because it was the bridge Eleanor had warned me about. The first clean yes that would let every later theft arrive wearing precedent. Mara had set the table with Eleanor's silver. That detail cut deeper than it should have. My wife had polished that set every December while complaining the whole ritual was ridiculous because nobody under 70 noticed the difference between good silver and decent stainless steel. After her funeral, Mara had asked if she could temporarily store the pieces because I seemed overwhelmed. I had said yes. Apparently temporary had ended with my own place settings arranged for a private ambush. Richard poured wine. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who had spent 30 years entering my house without ever needing to knock. Tall, silver at the temples, expensive casual clothes, the same deep voice that had once closed vendor deals and soothed my panic the day Eleanor collapsed in the kitchen. Every memory I had of trust now had his face somewhere near it. "Arthur," he said, "you look tired." "I am," he smiled. Understandable. Everything about the meal was designed to feel reasonable. That was the genius of it. No one said, "We are here to discuss how to strip you carefully." They said things like, "How are you sleeping? Have you been eating enough? You shouldn't be alone with all this paperwork. Maybe the business should run lighter for a while. These houses become dangerous for men living alone. Grief affects memory in strange ways. Not one sentence illegal. All of them setting the table for incapacity." Daniel barely touched his food. He looked worse than the others, which made him more dangerous in its own way. A man suffering can still go along with evil if someone else promises him there is no clean path back. Halfway through the meal, Mara brought out a folder. Lydia had predicted that exact move. Mara rested the folder beside my bread plate like she was offering me an article of comfort. "Arthur," she said softly, "I know this isn't easy. We don't want to push. We just want to reduce pressure." Reduce pressure. Inside the folder were draft documents giving Daniel temporary oversight authority over certain business operations and certain household financial decisions, pending emotional stabilization and medical review. Not full guardianship. Not yet. Something more dangerous. A bridge. A first legal yes from me that would let them argue later that I had already acknowledged my own decline. Richard spoke gently from the far end of the table. "This doesn't take anything from you. It just gives Daniel room to help." Daniel did not look up. That mattered. If he had believed himself innocent, he would have met my eyes and tried to sell it. Shame had him staring at the gravy boat. I let my hand hover over the papers. Mara leaned in. "You don't have to decide tonight," which translated meant, "Please decide tonight while we still control tone, room, and food." "I'd like to think," I said. Richard tilted his head. He had always hated delayed advantage. "About what?" That was the first honest question anyone had asked all evening. I set the papers down. "About why every person at this table seemed so interested in lightening my burden when no one asked what Eleanor was carrying before she died." Silence. Mara recovered first. "She was carrying grief for Daniel. We all were." "No," I said. "She was carrying records." Daniel's fork stopped in his hand. Richard's expression did not change. That was how I knew he was afraid. He had spent decades cultivating the face of a man who could absorb bad news without visible reaction. He wore it now, but he stopped drinking. Small things expose men before big things do. Mara smiled. "I don't know what that means." "Of course you do." I stood, not abruptly, just enough to make them look at me from their carefully set places. "I'm very tired," I said. "So I'm going to say one plain thing. If any of you ever bring legal paperwork into my house again without asking me first, I will have the sheriff remove you." Then I walked to the sink and poured my wine out where they could hear it hit the drain. That broke the spell more effectively than shouting would have. Richard rose slowly. "Arthur, no one here is your enemy." I turned and looked at him. "My wife built a room inside our wall before she died. Not the whole truth. Enough truth." For the first time in 30 years, Richard Hale's face showed me something unfiltered. Calculation. Fast, cold, violent in its own way. He covered it immediately. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about leaving," I said. Dinner ended 3 minutes later. Warren, listening from the surveillance van Aaron had parked a quarter-mile away, later told me the microphones caught one useful detail after they thought they were outside range. Mara, near the front walk, whispering hard enough to clip the audio. He found something. Richard's answer, "Then we accelerate." That was all, but it was enough. The next morning, $50,000 moved out of my business operating account on a forged authorization. Not attempted, completed. The bank's fraud department treated me politely and uselessly. They emailed the request form. The signature looked like mine at a glance, and wrong at the bone. The line pressure on the B in Barrett was too thin. The cross on the T slanted up instead of level. Little things. But your own name, signed for 40 years, develops its own skeleton. I called Warren first. He told me what I already knew. They're building documentary evidence that you're losing control. then Lydia, then the bank's counsel. By noon, I had filed a fraud claim, frozen secondary accounts, and locked business disbursements behind dual authorization. That should have slowed them. At 1:15, a package arrived. No return address. Inside was a prescription bottle with my name typed on the label. Night support tablets. Take one at bedtime for agitation and sleep quality. Prescriber, Dr. Stephen Vale. I had not seen Vale since Eleanor's death. There was a note attached. Arthur, Daniel mentioned sleep has been difficult. These should help settle you. Call the office if symptoms persist. Stephen first carried the bottle out to the garage, set it on the workbench, and stared at it under the fluorescent light. A year earlier, I would have believed it was concern. Now it looked like procedure. Warren sent one of the tablets to a lab through a contact of his in Augusta. The result came back after dark. Heavy sedative, wrong dosage for a first prescription. Enough to make a man confused, unstable on his feet, and helpfully unreliable if anyone later described his behavior to a judge. Lydia drove over with the printed result and sat at my kitchen table until nearly midnight going over scenarios. They are not probing anymore, she said. They are documenting towards something. What? She did not soften the answer. Incapacity if they can make it civil. Death if they decide civil is too slow. I believed her immediately. That frightened me less than the speed with which I believed it. On Tuesday, Lydia called before breakfast. They filed. The petition was worse than I expected, and exactly as ugly as Eleanor would have predicted. Emergency motion for temporary oversight pending medical competency evaluation. Supporting affidavit from Mara. Supplemental business concern statement from Daniel. Medical concern memorandum from Dr. Vale. Recommended interim fiduciary structure, naming Daniel primary, with outside administrative support through a trust office connected to, no surprise, one of Richard's attorneys. They had chosen speed over elegance. That helped us. Fast fraud sheds lint. Lydia filed our response within hours and requested an expedited independent neurological exam, handwriting analysis on the forged transfer, and a review of Vale's prescription conduct. Warren moved the financial file to a forensic accountant named Denise Holloway, who found enough irregularity in one afternoon to mutter profanity at my dining table and ask for a second lamp because whoever cooked the shell entities had not expected resistance from adults who knew how ledgers breathe. Denise mapped the transfers across my business, the marina consulting fronts, the condo trust, and 3 personal guarantees Daniel had signed without telling me. One of the guarantees tied back to a bad real estate position Richard had steered him into 2 years earlier. Debt. Eleanor had guessed leverage. Denise gave it shape. Richard loaned Daniel money after the investment failed. The note terms looked generous on the first page and predatory by the last. Cross-default clauses, security interests, personal confidentiality language, moral conduct provisions hidden under a respectability blanket. He didn't just own your son's debt, Denise said. He owned his fear. That phrase stayed with me. By Wednesday, we had enough to see the machine. Richard found Daniel at his most ashamed, tied rescue to obedience, introduced Mara as a stabilizing force, brought in Vale as medical credibility, and turned the whole arrangement into a pipeline. Control the son, pathologize the father, sedate the mother when she notices, harvest the estate before grief hardens into suspicion. It was not only money, that made it worse. Warren had spent the meantime digging into Richard's past with Eleanor. Not rumors. Dates, records, old yearbooks, correspondence held in archives people forget exist because they assume no one will ever care enough to ask. Richard and Eleanor had dated through college and 1 year after. I knew that much in the broad, harmless way husbands sometimes know their wives once loved other men and choose not to picture it too clearly. What I had not known was how the ending unfolded. Eleanor had broken it off after Richard pressured her to move to New York with him instead of taking the bookkeeping job that brought her back to Maine and into my life the following spring. He had written her 4 letters in 6 months after she married me. Not love letters. Arguments disguised as manifestos. She had apparently answered none of them. Warren found one because Eleanor had kept it in a folder at Lydia's office decades earlier, after Richard became my business partner and she decided privately that old paper sometimes mattered longer than pride wanted to admit. The letter was not romantic, it was humiliated. You chose a safe man because safe men are easier to manage. One day you'll call that wisdom. I'll call it cowardice. I read it twice and felt old memories reorder themselves. The way Richard always joked a little too long about Eleanor's caution. The way he lingered after dinners. How quickly he inserted himself into our business when my first partner retired. How naturally he attached himself to Daniel, once Daniel reached the age to admire power and confuse it with steadiness. Patience can look like character if you do not check what it feeds on. Thursday morning, the judge denied immediate emergency control and ordered the independent exam. That was our first real win. It was also, according to Lydia, the point at which men like Richard stop expecting law to solve timing for them. At 3 in the afternoon, my brakes failed on Route 1 heading south. It happened on a long curve above the marsh, where the shoulder narrows and the guardrail ends too soon. One moment the truck responded, the next the pedal sank soft and stupid to the floor and kept going. I have driven those roads for 40 years. Habit saved me first, instinct second. I downshifted, dragged the transmission, rode the emergency brake in pulses, and used the sandy lip of a bait shop turnout to scrub enough speed that I hit a low post instead of the tidal ditch beyond it. The impact threw me sideways into the window and split the skin above my eyebrow. I tasted blood and battery dust. Then I sat there breathing hard, both hands still gripping the wheel, and knew with a clarity that felt almost clean that no more part of this was subtle. The deputy who arrived first wanted to call it age and wear. Warren, arriving 20 minutes later, slid under the truck with a flashlight, swore once, and asked the deputy to kneel down with him. Brake line, clean cut, partially nicked first, meant to fail under pressure, not while parked. That night I slept at Lydia's lake cottage with Warren on the downstairs couch and Aaron hardening every digital account we could think of. The ride to Lydia's cottage should have calmed me. It did the opposite. Shock wears off in layers, and one of those layers is transportation. While danger is happening, the body chooses sequence over meaning. Downshift, turn, brace, breathe, speak to deputy, nod at Warren, get stitched, sign tow release. Sit down only when somebody older and wiser than pride tells you to sit down. Meaning enters later, usually in the passenger seat. Lydia drove because Warren said my hands still had too much tremor in them to trust a wet road after an attempted murder. We took the long route around the marsh because she preferred visibility to speed. Her wipers kept strict time. The radio stayed off. Every oncoming set of headlights made my shoulders tighten anyway. Halfway there, she said, "You don't get points for pretending you're less frightened than you are." I looked out at the dark pines and said, "I'm not frightened." She nodded once. "Fine, then what are you?" I thought about that for most of a mile. "Done," I said finally. "That will do for tonight." The cottage belonged to her family and looked like the kind of place New Englanders insist is modest even while it has lake frontage and inherited confidence. Small living room, stone fireplace. Utility kitchen, 2 bedrooms upstairs, 1 couch too firm for comfort and therefore useful to visiting attorneys. Warren took the couch without discussion. Aaron spread cables, spare phones, and a portable router across the kitchen table like a field surgeon laying out instruments. I washed the blood from my eyebrow in the bathroom sink and looked at myself too long in the mirror. Older, yes. Angrier, too. But not wrecked. That bothered me in a way I did not expect. You spend your whole life believing attempted murder ought to leave some visible moral alteration on a face. It does not. You still look like the same man who once forgot propane refills before a holiday weekend, who once stood on the porch with his wife arguing about azaleas, who once believed friendship accumulated into fact if you waited long enough. I came downstairs and found Warren in the pantry with a legal pad. "What are you doing?" "Making a list of everything they can still reach before morning." "What's on it?" "You." That was not sarcasm. Not entirely. Phones, email, payroll credentials, home entry, medical records, storage units, vendor contacts, your son, the child, any lawyer you haven't warned. Anything Richard has ever had reason to photograph while pretending he was admiring your discipline. He said it all in one flat run, and by the time he was done, I understood something else ugly about the kind of people now circling my life. They do not think of danger the way decent people do. Decent people think in acts. Break-in, crash, poison, petition. Predators think in access. Whatever they can still touch, they still consider usable. Aaron found the first live intrusion before midnight. Not into my bank this time, into the company vendor portal. Somebody had tried to authorize a shipment adjustment and secondary payout reroute using an old admin credential 1. Daniel should have lost months earlier when Eleanor updated our permissions. "She was right again," Aaron muttered. "About what?" He turned the laptop toward me. "They move in groups. If one channel closes, another tests immediately. There is something spiritually corrosive about hearing your dead wife continue to be correct in real time. Lydia made soup no one wanted. Warren drank it anyway. I stood by the window looking at black lake water and trying not to imagine Eleanor swallowing whatever Vale gave her while Richard kept a straight face 2 rooms away. At 11:32, the threat text arrived. "Stop making strangers important. Family can still end this quietly, quietly." That word told me more than the threat itself. Men who intend only paperwork do not care about quiet. They care about outcome. Men who have crossed into physical removal suddenly care very much about quiet because the alternative is spectacle, and spectacle threatens all the respectable structures they built to keep rot looking like caution. Lydia read the text over my shoulder. "Good," she said. I turned. Good? Yes, it means pressure is working. I almost snapped at her. Instead, I asked, You call that pressure? I call that a man who expected timing to remain his and is beginning to understand it may not. She was right, but expertise does not always make a sentence pleasant to receive. Sleep came in fragments that night. The first hour I lay awake, listening to the cottage settle and wondering whether every unknown vehicle on the road beyond the trees belonged to somebody watching. The second hour I dreamed Eleanor was in her office, moving binders from one shelf to another, and would not turn around when I called her name. The third hour I did sleep, but badly, and woke convinced for half a second that I was back in my own house and had simply imagined the brake line, the chamber, the journal, the medicated cruelty of the past month. Then the ceiling over the guest room reminded me where I was. At 4:47 I went downstairs and found Warren already up, drinking coffee that had the exhausted smell of a man who trusts only hot bitterness before dawn. Couldn't sleep? He asked. I did, poorly. That means you're still normal. He slid the mug toward me and said something I have not forgotten. Arthur, men like Richard don't escalate because they're strong. They escalate because they're cornered by sequence. Every time we verify one thing, they lose the ability to decide what this is called. What is it called now? He looked toward the dark window. Conspiracy if we're lucky, predation if we're honest. That was the Lake Cottage night in its cleanest form. No heroics, no speeches. Just the long, cold work of realizing I had crossed fully out of the emotional version of my life and into the evidentiary one Lydia named in my kitchen days earlier. By morning, the sky over the lake was pale iron, and the lab results on Eleanor's retained hair sample arrived. Elevated heavy metal exposure, inconsistent with her charted supplements. Repeated administration, suggested by distribution. Requires comparative review. The wording was clinical enough to avoid panic. It still hit like a hammer. I remember leaning both hands on the counter while Lydia read the report twice, and Warren stopped pretending there might still be an innocent explanation hiding in corners we had not turned yet. They killed her. I did not mean to say it out loud. The sentence simply reached daylight because there was no room left inside me where it could still be stored. Warren answered yes, not maybe. Not likely, yes. From that minute on, every smaller question became subordinate. Did Daniel know how much? Did Mara start this or scale it? Did Vale enjoy authority more than money? Did Richard ever once imagine a line he would not cross? Those still mattered. But the central fact had hardened. My wife was not merely gone. She had been professionally, patiently, socially, and medically hunted inside her own family circle. And I was not next by accident. I was next by design. That knowledge did not make me braver. It made me less available for negotiation. At 11:32, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Stop making strangers important. Family can still end this quietly. Richard did not sign his threats because he had spent too long learning that unsigned menace sounds more omnipotent. By Friday morning, the lab results on Eleanor's retained hair sample. Lydia had persuaded the funeral home to preserve more than I knew, came back with elevated heavy metal exposure inconsistent with her documented medications. Not a smoking gun, not yet, but enough to reopen what had once been called natural. Enough for Lydia to request exhumation review, and enough for me to stand in the cottage kitchen, staring out at a half-frozen lake, and finally say the sentence I had been avoiding. They killed her. Warren answered from behind me. Yes. He did not say maybe. He did not say probably. Yes. I have been asked since whether that was the moment I broke. No, it was the moment I stopped wanting decency from people who had mistaken it for weakness. The competency evaluation took place the following Monday in a beige office above a dental practice. Dr. Naomi Baird, the neurologist Lydia chose, had the kind of manner that made people either confess or become offended. She did not flatter. She did not rescue. She asked me dates, timelines, word recall, sequencing, financial reasoning, medication lists, and hypothetical scenarios involving travel, invoices, and memory interference. At the end, she shut the folder and said, Mr. Barrett, if anyone tells a court you are cognitively unfit, they are either incompetent or lying. Lydia smiled for the first time in days. The hearing was set for Thursday. Richard moved before then. Daniel called Tuesday evening and asked if he could come by alone. Alone. That was new enough that I agreed. He arrived after dark without Mara. No casserole, no soft language. Just my son in a navy jacket looking older than his 42 years and thinner than guilt usually makes a man at first glance. We sat in the kitchen because kitchens force honesty better than living rooms. He did not touch the coffee I poured him. Dad, he said, you need to stop. Not I'm sorry, not I made a mistake, not Richard is dangerous, you need to stop. I looked at him until he finally met my eyes. Stop what? Everything. The lawyers, the digging, the accusations. Or what? He swallowed. That's the problem. You think this is still about papers. There it was. The first clean warning from him. I kept my voice flat. What is it about? He looked toward the dark window over the sink. Damage control. Yours? No answer. Or Richard's? His jaw tightened. You don't understand what he can do. I almost said, I think your mother did. Instead, I asked a better question. What did he promise you when he started helping? Daniel laughed once with no humor in it, that he could fix one bad year. The truth came in pieces after that, not enough to absolve him, enough to explain the slope. He talked longer than he meant to once he started. That is often how compromised men finally tell partial truth. Not bravely, not cleanly. They simply grow too tired to keep curating themselves sentence by sentence. The failed investment had begun as something almost embarrassingly ordinary. A waterfront parcel outside Bath that looked underpriced because the permits were complicated and the current owners were desperate. Daniel thought he could get in cheap, subdivide later, and finally prove to himself he was more than the safe son who inherited a business built by steadier people. Mara liked the deal because it promised velocity. Richard liked it because it promised leverage. I disliked it vaguely because the brochure used the phrase transformative opportunity 3 times in 2 pages, which usually means a man in loafers wants farmers to subsidize his fantasy. Daniel signed anyway. The first surprise was a drainage dispute. The second was a tribal access complication. The third was cost creep. By then he had already borrowed against expected sale value, then against bridge financing, then against the first loan to protect himself from the second. He told me none of this at the time. He told Richard. Because he sounded calm, Daniel said. It is incredible how much damage the appearance of calm can do in the hands of the wrong older man. Richard did not scold him, did not act shocked. He simply made rescue sound technical. Short-term coverage here, temporary routing there, business-facing cash smoothing, a private note so creditors do not smell blood, a way to avoid unnecessary embarrassment until things stabilize. The first transfer from company-adjacent structures into Daniel's crisis was framed as preservation. Keep the family company from reputational splash if the development debt got noisy. The second transfer was framed as bridge support. The third, Daniel admitted, was simply theft described in language soft enough that he could still sleep if he repeated it right. Mara became essential the moment shame entered. She was good, he said, at making bad things sound survivable if only everyone agreed to the next compromise fast enough. She found language, spousal separation risk, reputational shielding, temporary capacity pressure, family systems fallout. None of it meant anything decent. All of it meant Daniel no longer had to say I stole, or I am trapped, or I need to tell my father the truth. He could instead say we are containing volatility. That is what higher order lying does for people. It lends a frightened man vocabulary expensive enough to hide his own face from himself. And Vale? I asked. Daniel rubbed both hands over his mouth before answering. I didn't go to him first. Mara did. Of course she did. According to Daniel, the panic attack started after the third creditor threat and the first real possibility that I might see irregularities in the company books before Richard had a chance to sequence the correction. Daniel could not sleep, could not focus, started waking at 3 a.m. with the absolute conviction that every room in his life contained a witness waiting to expose him. Mara took him to Vale privately, not through the main practice schedule. Through a side arrangement Richard helped facilitate because discretion mattered. Vale medicated him quickly, mild at first, then not mild, something to sleep, something for nerves, something to keep him functional through temporary stress exposure. By the time Daniel noticed he was relying on a system rather than treatment, the system included all 3 of them. Richard for money, Mara for management. Vale for permission to keep calling collapse something clinical instead of moral. I asked him whether Richard had ever threatened him directly. He surprised me by shaking his head. Not at first, he said. He didn't need to. He just kept making the alternatives feel smaller. That sentence was smarter than most of what Daniel had managed all month, and it told me more than anything else he said. Threat is crude. Richard preferred scale. If Daniel confessed, creditors and prosecutors would come. If Daniel told me, the business would implode and Noah would pay for it. If Daniel questioned Mara, she would remind him how much she had protected. If Daniel questioned Vale, Vale would imply destabilization. If Daniel hesitated around Richard, Richard would simply show him the latest numbers and ask whether he wanted me to see them unprocessed. By the time Eleanor fell ill, Daniel's life had been turned into a corridor with walls built from prior compromise. Every choice still technically existed. Few of them looked livable. Did you ever think of telling Mom? I asked. He laughed then, but softly and with something close to horror in it. She knew before I did. I believed that immediately. He said Eleanor started asking cleaner questions than anyone else. Not angry ones, exact ones. Why did Daniel suddenly need Richard copied on vendor transfers unrelated to expansion? Why had Mara asked the business attorney about limited capacity certifications for a cousin and then used the same phrase at our dinner table? Why was Vale changing medications so often without wanting second opinions? Why was Richard visiting more during the months Eleanor was weakest, not less? Every time she asked something simple, Daniel said, the room changed. That is how truth first appears in bad systems. It changes temperature. He told me about one afternoon in particular, 6 weeks before Eleanor died. She found him in the warehouse office and asked why the marina restoration entity routing a payment had the same mailing pattern as one of Richard's older redevelopment disputes. Daniel said he froze. Not because he had a lie ready, because he suddenly understood she was no longer asking from suspicion. She was asking from sequence. She had enough pieces already to tell whether his answer matched reality. "What did you say?" I asked. He stared at his untouched coffee. I told her I'd explain later. "Did you?" "No. Why not?" His answer came out as barely more than breath. "Because later is where cowards live." That line stayed with me, not because it redeemed him, because it was the first thing he said that sounded like a man who might eventually survive his own reflection. Then he ruined some of that progress by saying he still believed bringing formal oversight against me might have bought time. That nearly made me hit him. Bought time for whom? For me to be stripped clean more politely. For him to keep pretending he was containing something instead of feeding it. For Richard to convert debt into inheritance. For Mara to turn my widowhood into procedure. For Vale to keep prescribing softness until I lost enough edge to sign whatever was put in front of me. I did not hit him. I am old, not holy. Instead, I said, "Do you understand that every compromise you accepted moved the danger downstream into somebody who loved you more than you loved the truth?" He closed his eyes. Yes, it was the right answer. Much too late. Still the right answer. When he rose to leave, he looked less like a man coming to warn his father and more like a man delivering a message from the cell he had helped build. At the door, he turned back. If Richard thinks you can embarrass him publicly, he'll move off documents. He hates being looked at when he's losing shape. What shape is that? The one where he's still the smartest man in the room. After he left, I stood in the kitchen for a long time with my hand on the back of the chair he had used. There is a kind of grief reserved for learning your child has not become evil cleanly enough to hate, nor decent enough to save without cost. That was the grief Daniel left me with. And it was still in the room when I went to court 2 days later and watched him help try to bury me in forms he only half believed in. The real estate investment had failed bigger than he admitted. He borrowed privately before he borrowed from Richard, then borrowed from Richard to cover what he'd privately borrowed. Mara told him she understood crisis management and private legal exposure better than anyone he knew. Richard rolled the debt into business structures. Vale wrote a stress and sleep prescription after Daniel had what was probably his first panic attack. Everyone around him became useful at once. By the time Eleanor started asking questions, Daniel was already trapped in the logic of people who tell you they are protecting the family from what the truth would cost. "Did you know about Mom's medication?" I asked. He answered too slowly. "No, not a lie. Not clean truth." Did he know the chemistry? Probably not. Did he know something was being managed around her? Yes. Did you know they were preparing papers on me? Silence. "You brought them to my table," I said. His face folded in on itself for a second. I kept thinking if it got formal, it might keep things from turning into something worse. That sentence explained more than any confession could have. Cowardice is rarely dramatic in families. It is administrative, incremental, a chain of bad compromises dressed as prevention. "Do you love your son?" I asked. He flinched. "What kind of question is that?" "The kind that has an answer." "Yes." "Then why are you helping people who prepare to make Noah think I'm unstable and his grandmother paranoid?" He stood so abruptly, his chair scraped hard against the floor. "You think this is simple because you came in late. I've been living inside this for years." He was right and wrong. Late is not the same as exempt. Before leaving, he said one thing that mattered. If you force him into the open, he won't try to win in court anymore. Not if. When. That warning stayed with me all through the Thursday hearing. The courtroom itself was nothing dramatic. Fluorescent lights, wood veneer, 2 clocks that disagreed by 3 minutes. Mara in pale gray, composed and falsely saddened. Vale in his dark suit and polished shoes. Richard at the back rather than counsel table. Because men like him prefer influence to visible ownership until the exact second visible ownership profits them. Lydia dismantled them with the patience of a woman picking glass out of carpet. Dr. Baird's evaluation, the forged transfer signature, the sedative pills, the hidden cameras, the shell entities. The shell entities again, because repetition helps when jurists need to understand that coincidence has long since left the room. Vale tried to sound wounded and professional. Mara tried to sound practical and overburdened. Daniel tried to sound like a son trapped between love and necessity. Then Lydia introduced Eleanor's recording. Not all of it, just enough. If they move quickly after I die, it means they were already prepared. The judge listened to my dead wife's voice in total silence, then denied the petition in language sharper than I expected. Mr. Barrett is plainly competent. This filing appears to have been built on manipulated financial events and troubling medical representations. I am referring the supporting materials for further review. Mara went white. Vale looked at Richard. Richard did not move. That was how I knew the hearing had cost him less emotionally than tactically. He was not wounded. He was recalculating. As we exited the courthouse, he finally approached me. No anger, no bluster, just that old calm he had always used when making bad ideas sound inevitable. You should have let this stay private, I answered without thinking. So should you, he smiled a little. Arthur, public things become very difficult to control. He meant, I preferred to own your collapse without witnesses. I said, you're losing your timing. He looked genuinely amused by that. Am I? Then he stepped closer and said the quietest line he had spoken to me in 30 years. She still chose you at the end, you know. Even after all that, funny what loyalty survives. For a second, the air changed around me, because no one had said at the end. No one but Eleanor's killer would know how close to the end she remained herself. Richard saw the recognition in my face and walked away before I could answer. Warren, who had caught only the posture and not the words from 20 feet away, asked what he said. Enough, I told him. He said enough. That night, the State Elder Fraud Unit asked for copies of everything. That was progress. It was not safety. At 2:13 in the morning, someone came in through the mudroom. Warren heard the hinge before I did. 1 second, I was half asleep in Lydia's cottage guest room. The next, he was downstairs shouting, and the house was full of the kind of noise furniture makes when violence arrives too quickly to stay elegant. By the time I reached the hallway with the old baseball bat Lydia kept beside the linen closet, Warren had a man face down on the kitchen tile, and one of the state troopers from the overnight watch team was cuffing him. The intruder wore black, carried lock tools, a suppressed pistol, and a loaded syringe. The syringe tested positive for potassium chloride. Quiet heart attack in a sleeping widower. No rough struggle, no obvious murder, just another older man whose heart gave out under stress. The man lawyered up immediately. The burner phone in his jacket held a message thread scrubbed in parts and sloppy in others. Do it clean. Before the estate meeting. No visible trauma, no name, crypto transfer pending. Still not enough for a direct charge on Richard. Enough for me to stop wondering whether he might retreat. He would not retreat. He would only change methods. The estate meeting turned out to be the hinge. Eleanor had altered her will 3 weeks before her death and left the revision with Lydia under sealed instructions not to open it until 1 year had passed unless there was evidence of fraud or coercion affecting her estate. Between the journal, the recorder, the petition, the lab results, and the attempted break-in, Lydia now had enough to justify early review under the protective clause. We opened it on Saturday. I had spent all morning dreading the practical injury, disinheritance, amended trusts, some final evidence of how far Eleanor's fear had forced her from me, and instead found something worse and better at once. She had not cut Daniel out entirely. She had cut him out conditionally. His share was suspended and placed under a protective trust for Noah until any investigation into fraud, undue influence, or suspicious medical conduct was resolved. My controlling business interest, if I died under disputed circumstances, was not to pass through Daniel at all. It was to go into a charitable foundation for maritime apprenticeships with Noah as eventual discretionary beneficiary and Lydia as interim protector. In plain language, Eleanor had built a dead man's switch. If they pushed too hard and I died too conveniently, they did not inherit. They triggered the exact opposite. I laughed when Lydia explained it. Not because it was funny, because my wife, who hated drama and unbalanced checkbooks in equal measure, had prepared revenge in trust language. Warren read the clause twice and whistled low. She saw them coming. Yes, I said, long before I did. That will change everything. Richard did not know the exact contents yet, but he knew Eleanor had prepared something. The attempted break-in had almost certainly aimed at any remaining physical evidence. The intruder's message referenced the estate meeting. That meant Richard understood time had narrowed. We met that afternoon at the state office with investigator Clara Wynn from Elder Fraud, Detective Holleran from the county, Denise the accountant, Aaron on tech, Lydia, Warren, and me. Clara's real talent revealed itself after everyone stopped talking. Most investigators I had known through harbor thefts, insurance disputes, Or one ugly employee embezzlement 15 years earlier believed the point of a meeting was to gather statements. Clara used meetings to watch where silence pooled, who rushed to fill it, which facts made people look at the table instead of each other, which pieces everyone accepted too fast because they fit a story they preferred. By the time we finished laying out Eleanor's will, the account charts, the camera map, the brake sabotage, the sedatives, and the timeline around her death, Clara had written almost nothing. Then she capped her pen and said, "Richard believes he is the author. Mara believes she is the operator. Vale believes he is insulated by profession. Daniel believes he can still survive if he chooses the least humiliating collapse. That is 4 different self-concepts. We do not need to destroy all 4 at once. We only need to put them in a room where each one starts protecting itself before Richard can restore hierarchy." That was the dinner plan in a sentence. Not trick them into a cinematic confession, not scare them into sudden honesty. Break sequence, break chain of command, make self-preservation compete with loyalty. Lydia laid Eleanor's revised will flat on the table then and walked us through the mechanism my wife had built while dying. The structure was elegant in the severe way Eleanor preferred all good solutions. If I died or was declared incapacitated within a defined review period following her death, operational authority over the company did not pass to Daniel by default, nor to any spouse, nor through immediate family petition. It froze. A fiduciary panel involving Lydia, an outside accountant, and a court-approved commercial trustee took over until a full fraud and coercion review cleared all disputed parties. Daniel's expected inheritance converted into a restricted educational trust for Noah if Daniel was under investigation for acts against either of us. Residential property could not be sold inside the same window without secondary judicial review. Any attempt to use medical or cognitive emergency language to force quick transfer triggered automatic contest instructions Eleanor had already funded in advance. Eleanor, who hated drama, had built a dead man's switch out of trust law. I would have laughed if the admiration had not hurt so much. Clara asked why Richard had not simply let the will open and then fought from there. Lydia answered first, because the structure does not just block him, it names the possibility of him. That was the true brilliance. Eleanor had not needed to prove everything inside the will. She only needed to make quick extraction impossible and suspicion durable enough that any rational thief would panic at delay. Richard needed me compliant or legally blurred before the estate review matured. Needed Daniel still close enough to function as family face. Needed Mara credible enough to sound caregiving rather than acquisitive. Needed Vale still medically useful rather than exposed. Every week we delayed that sequence. Their options narrowed and their interests diverged. Denise flipped to a fresh sheet and added one more pressure point. "Asset freezes start making side structures noisy soon," she said. "If we keep tightening access, someone starts blaming someone else for what should have already been secured." "Who blames first?" I asked. "Mara," she said without hesitation. "Operators blame faster than architects. They're closer to cleanup." Aaron, who had been quiet until then, finally looked up from his equipment case. "Richard also assumes your house is still part of his stagecraft," he said to me. "He has years of behavioral data from that environment. He knows what you look like grieving there. He knows where you stand when you're cornered, what room you retreat to, how long you wait before answering hard questions. If we bring them into the same house, he'll feel superior." "And that helps us how?" "Because confidence reduces caution," Clara said. "And men like him talk in more complete sentences when they believe terrain belongs to them." I disliked the logic immediately, because it meant the best trap required me to host the people who had hollowed out my life under my own roof and let them think they were still choosing the terms of my collapse. Useful plans often offend the emotions that would otherwise keep a person alive. We spent nearly 3 hours on details. What gets placed where, which papers appear first, and which remain hidden till fracture. When audio becomes enough. What my role is if Daniel breaks early. What not to say if Richard turns sentimental, because obsession often tries romance once control starts slipping. How to keep Mara from fleeing under the excuse of protecting Noah. How to make Vale choose between medical abstraction and personal exposure. Where the unmarked units park. Which window gives Warren the cleanest angle. What code phrase triggers movement if I lose the room physically. What happens if Richard refuses to engage at all? That last one mattered most to me because smart men do sometimes smell the wall closing in and retreat into perfect silence. Clara did not seem worried. "He will speak," she said. "How can you be sure?" "Because he thinks this is his story," she answered. "People built like that cannot resist explaining why everyone else misunderstood the plot." She was right about him in exactly the way Eleanor had been right about him for longer. Before we broke for the evening, Lydia handed me a yellow legal pad with 3 sentences written on it. You do not rush. You do not explain more than necessary. You let silence make hierarchy visible. I folded the page and put it in my breast pocket. On the drive home, I thought less about Richard than about Eleanor drafting clauses while her hair came loose in the shower and some part of her body already knew the chemistry had gone wrong. She had done all of that while I was still living inside the old husband's assumption that if something truly monstrous entered a family, decency would recognize it in time. What she had recognized instead was procedure. How quickly grief gets translated into signatures. How easily concern can front for control. How much evil likes comfortable chairs, cooked meat, and phrases such as temporary support. That night, I took the dining room table measurements for Aaron because he wanted exact wire range under the sideboard. I had eaten at that table for 19 years. Family dinners, tax season arguments, Noah coloring while Eleanor pretended not to notice marker caps near polished wood, Richard carving Christmas roast one year because my wrist was in a brace, Mara bringing over lemon bars after the funeral, Daniel sitting 2 seats down and telling me once, years ago, that he hoped Noah would grow up close to all of us. A table accumulates memory without asking what kind. Now it was going to accumulate evidence. By the time I set the tape measure down, I understood the cruel symmetry of the whole thing. Richard had spent years using intimacy as infrastructure. Holidays, medical access, shared business, old photographs, familiar rooms, all of it was supposed to make extraction cleaner because proximity breeds plausible explanations. We were about to use the same intimacy against him, not by becoming like him, by forcing what proximity had hidden to speak in front of itself. That was the plan, cold enough to work, personal enough to hurt, and shaped, the entire time, by a dead woman who understood timing better than all of us. The room looked sterile enough to flatten emotion, which helped. Clara was younger than I expected and less sentimental than television trains people to hope. She built cases the way Denise mapped money, by sequence, motive, and moments where people stop lying consistently because pressure splits their interests apart. Right now, Clara said, we have fraud, surveillance, attempted coercive control, likely medical abuse, possible homicide, and a failed contract kill that points toward your circle without locking on any one head yet. That is a strong pile. It is not a finished shape. What finishes it? I asked. She looked at the wall rather than at me, as if confession were easier to discuss as architecture. We need them to explain themselves in relation to one another. Not a perfect confession, not a grand speech, not Hollywood. Something better, contradiction, blame, ownership. When families built on managed lies start cracking, each member protects a different thing. One protects money, one protects image, one protects access to the child, one protects a medical license, one protects the fantasy that none of this was ever about obsession. Clara wanted all 5 protections in one room at once. I knew what room she meant before she said it. My dining room. I said no immediately, not because the idea was bad, because it was too elegant. Fight them, disarm them. Let greed and panic do the talking while microphones do the remembering. It sounded exactly like the kind of plan Richard would admire in someone else. Clara did not push. She simply laid out the advantages. They already believed they could still manage me. Daniel was wobbling. Mara was cornered by the failed petition. Vale was exposed enough to become self-protective. Richard would not skip a chance to contain a situation if he thought it could still be done privately. And if we announced a family settlement discussion connected to Eleanor's estate review, they would come. Because greed hates absence. Because arrogance assumes invitation means influence. Because none of them, not even Richard, truly believed I could construct the room they had spent a year constructing around me. By sunset, I had agreed. We would stage a settlement dinner for Thursday evening. Not a public meeting, not a law office. My house. A chance to talk before outside people turned everything uglier. A chance to discuss Eleanor's revisions. A chance to make one final family decision quietly. Lydia drafted the invitations with surgical politeness. Daniel, as my son, received the warmest note. Mara got precision and reassurance. Vale got a professional courtesy frame about medical misunderstandings. Richard got the line I insisted on myself. After all these years, I think families should settle family matters face to face. Warren laughed when he read it. Cold, he said. Not cold enough, I answered. The days before Thursday were preparation and theater. Aaron swept the house, removed every hostile device we could find, and replaced the environment with our own equipment so subtle it made the old cameras look like toys. He wired the dining room light fixture, sideboard, and smoke alarm, then placed audio redundancy in 2 decorative bowls Eleanor would have hated for their dust. Backup receivers ran to the parked florist van Clara's team would use down the block. Lydia helped me choose which truths to reveal and which to hold. That mattered more than I expected. Too much evidence too soon would send everyone into silence. Too little would let Richard keep control of tone. So we built stages. Stage 1, I tell them I know Eleanor left records. Stage 2, I reveal the revised will and what happens if I die under suspicion. Stage 3, I mention the forged transfer, the cameras, and the independent exam. Stage 4, I let them fight over which damage matters most. Stage 5, if needed, I introduce one of the following: the sedative pills, the lab results on Eleanor, the intruder with the syringe, or the old letter Richard wrote Eleanor, only if needed. Clara approved the structure. Truth is not ammunition if you dump it in a heap, she said. It's sequencing. Daniel called Wednesday night. His voice sounded wrecked. Dad, do we really need to do this? Yes. A long silence. Then very softly, you don't know everything. I almost said, then tell me. Instead, I answered, no, I know enough to stop being led. He hung up without another word. On Thursday afternoon, I stood in Eleanor's office for the first time since we cleared the hidden chamber into evidence boxes and looked at the empty wall. The room felt both desecrated and clearer, as if her absence had stopped pretending it could still be domestic and finally admitted what it had become. I said her name out loud once. Not a prayer, not a farewell, more like a promise that the evening ahead would not end in another managed explanation. Then I went downstairs, put on the dark blue jacket she always said made me look like I still respected mirrors, and set the table with the silver Mara had tried to weaponize. If there is any dignity left in revenge, it lives in preparation. By 6:45, the roast was warming under foil, the decanter was on the sideboard, Aaron's signal lights were green in the florist van, Clara and Halloran were in position, Lydia had her legal file in the pantry, and Warren was upstairs with line of sight through the office window to the front walk. At 6:58, Richard arrived first. Of course he did. He wanted the room before the others. Wanted the first read on my face. Wanted the advantage of being present when the weaker pieces entered. I opened the door myself. He wore charcoal, no overcoat, and the expression of a man attending a difficult but manageable merger. Arthur, he said. Richard. He stepped inside and looked around once. Subtle. Practiced. Noticing placement, exits, mood. Then he smiled faintly. I'm glad you came to your senses. I always do, I said. That answer pleased him too much. You could see it in the tiny relaxation at the edges of his mouth. Not joy. Relief mixed with contempt. He heard capitulation because men who spend years managing others often lose the ability to distinguish surrender from strategic stillness. I took his coat, though he had not brought one. Another small disruption. He had dressed for command, not weather. While he waited in the entry hall, he glanced once toward the office door, once toward the stairs, once toward the dining room sideboard. Inventory, angle, exit, witness. Richard's eyes moved the same way they used to at Harbor Properties before he bought them. Not admiring, valuing. I poured a little bourbon, I said. Thought we might need it. Good. He followed me into the living room where I had arranged the old armchairs in their usual useless triangle, exactly how they had sat during a dozen holiday visits and one terrible night after Eleanor's funeral when Richard stayed till almost midnight telling me, grief can make men easy targets if they do not let trusted friends shoulder logistics. I remember thinking then how steady he sounded. Now I heard the sales pitch under every old kindness. Richard accepted the drink and stood rather than sat. That, too, told me he felt ownership. Guests sit. Men who think the room is partly theirs remain standing while they absorb conditions. You look better than last week, he said. Do I? Yes. He swirled the bourbon once. Less unmoored. A beautiful word. Almost admiring. Entirely diagnostic. I let my gaze drift toward the fireplace where Eleanor's photograph now sat in a darker frame than before. Funny, I said. I feel the opposite. He followed my eyes to the photograph, and for half a second I saw something in him I had never previously named correctly. Not grief, not nostalgia, possessive irritation. The expression vanished almost immediately, replaced by that polished patience I had once admired in every crisis. Loss confuses orientation, he said. No, I answered. Only hidden things do that. He looked at me directly then. Really directly. The way men do right before deciding whether the evening will require knives or silk. Before he could answer, headlights swept across the front window. Mara and Daniel. They came in together, but not closely. That interested me immediately. Couples under unified pressure often unconsciously narrow the distance between them. Those already blaming each other widen it and then pretend not to notice. Mara entered first with a covered dish she did not need to bring. Prop food. Family theater. Daniel followed carrying nothing and looking like a man being escorted by his own bad decisions. Mara kissed the air near my cheek. Arthur, thank you for having us. Her tone was perfect. Not warm enough to suggest confidence, not cold enough to seem wary. Just the middle register of a woman prepared to become either caretaker or witness, depending on which role the evening rewarded. Daniel muttered hello and looked over my shoulder rather than into my face. I said, "You're early." Mara smiled. "I thought it would be better if we settled before Stephen arrived." There it was, not Dr. Vale, Stephen. Signal intimacy. Normalize his presence before anyone could challenge the legitimacy of it. Richard took Daniel's coat, not mine, not Mara's, Daniel's. The gesture lasted 1 second. It still taught the whole room who the son belonged to in Richard's mind. We moved into the dining room. Aaron had done his work well. Nothing looked staged. The roast rested under foil. Eleanor's old serving spoon lay exactly where it always had. Candles lit, but not romantic. My wife's linen napkins folded plainly. Glasses filled unevenly enough to look domestic rather than prepared. If a jury later saw photographs, they would not see a trap. They would see a family dinner in a respectable main home. That mattered. Evil prefers melodrama in court because melodrama allows distance. Ordinary rooms make juries imagine themselves. Mara's eyes moved over the table once and paused almost invisibly at the sideboard where Eleanor's silver-framed tray reflected the candlelight. She had expected the room to soothe me and flatter itself. It probably would have if she had not already spent months trying to turn my life into case management. Daniel took the chair he always took. 2 to my right. Richard chose the far end without asking. Also normal. Also ownership. Mara sat opposite Daniel so she could monitor his face without turning her head too often. That left Vale's chair to my immediate left, the place Eleanor used to reserve for whichever guest she trusted least because, as she once put it, "If I have to refill your wine, I may as well study you up close." At 7:12, Vale arrived carrying a bottle of red wine too expensive for the occasion and too impersonal to mean anything. He apologized for traffic. No one asked from where. He set the bottle down, shook my hand, and held it a fraction too long. "Arthur," he said, "you look steadier." Another diagnostic, another little verdict smuggled into a greeting. I said, "I've had reason." He searched my face and found, I think, exactly what Lydia and Clara hoped he would find. Not clarity, not accusation, not surrender either. Something tired enough that men like Vale mistake it for pliability. We sat. For the first 6 minutes, no one spoke above the level of weather and harbor maintenance. Richard asked whether the Coast Guard still planned to update channel markers before winter. Mara mentioned Noah's school concert. Vale asked after my eyebrow with polished concern. Daniel ate nothing. Not almost nothing. Nothing. Cut once. Moved food. Set the knife down. Started twice to drink water and stopped before the glass reached his mouth. Under the table, according to Aaron later, the ambient mics picked up enough shoe movement from him alone to sound like a trapped animal in dry leaves. Richard tried first. "We've all had difficult weeks," he said, as if moderating a board retreat after a failed quarter. But difficulty creates opportunities for clarity if people are willing to prioritize continuity over emotion. There is no sentence more dangerous than a manipulator's sermon on continuity. I carved another slice of roast and let the knife scrape the platter. "Continuity for what?" He did not answer immediately. "Good. Make them define the theft before they dress it. For the business," he said. "For Noah. For whatever can still be protected without further spectacle." Mara nodded at once. "Exactly." Vale folded his hands. "Stress escalates distortion," he said. "Everyone in this room would benefit from a less adversarial posture." My wife had once told me that a doctor using posture instead of facts in a family conversation is either lazy or hiding something. Sitting there hearing Vale reach for posture while microphones listened under the china, I nearly felt Eleanor in the room again, not spiritually, just methodologically. Correct, ahead of us, impatient with our slowness. I took a drink and set the glass down carefully. "Then let's try clarity," I said. No one touched their food after that. I almost admired the line. Almost. By 7:10, they were all there. My son, my daughter-in-law, my wife's doctor, my oldest friend. The table was set, the microphones were live, and for the first time in over a year, every person who had helped dismantle my life sat under my roof without knowing the room no longer belonged to them. We ate almost nothing. That is one of the details people later ask about. And it matters because it tells you what fear does to appetite, even in practiced liars. Mara pushed lamb around with her fork. Vale drank too much water. Daniel chewed mechanically and swallowed as if doing so took instruction. Only Richard seemed capable of tasting anything, which made him the only one at the table still arrogant enough to be useful. I let small talk survive exactly 6 minutes. Weather, fuel prices, a harbor dredging project. The polite dead language families use when every person present knows they are waiting for the first clean blade. Then I folded my napkin, set it beside my plate, and said, "Eleanor changed her will before she died." No one moved. Even Richard did not move. He only looked at me more carefully. "I thought you should all know that before anyone says anything tonight, they regret." Mara spoke first. "Arthur, if this is about us pushing paperwork too soon, I'm willing to apologize for tone." Tone. There it was again, the little anesthetic word, as if what she regretted were phrasing and not the architecture of the theft. "This isn't about tone," I said. Lydia stepped out of the pantry then, file in hand. Mara's face drained. Vale whispered something under his breath that the microphone barely caught. Daniel went rigid. Richard, to his credit or pathology, only leaned back slightly and adjusted his cuff. "Good evening," Lydia said, as if joining late for dessert. "What is this?" Daniel asked. "A legal witness," I answered. "Something your mother increasingly valued." Richard smiled without warmth. "Arthur, involving counsel before family speaks is rarely a sign of confidence." "No," Lydia said. "In this family, it's a sign of memory." She placed the file beside my plate and remained standing. I opened it slowly on purpose. Not performance. Control of pace. "Eleanor amended her estate instruments 3 weeks before her death," I said. "She did so because she believed she was being lied to by people in this room." No one interrupted. That surprised me. I think part of them expected a bluff and needed to hear the first impossible sentence before deciding which version of themselves to become. Mara chose offense. "This is insane." Vale chose procedural distance. If Eleanor was impaired, any late-life amendment should be reviewed carefully. Lydia answered him before I could. "It was, by me, at the time, with capacity notes stronger than any you filed about Arthur." That landed. Vale looked at Richard involuntarily. Exactly as Clara had predicted he might when forced to feel professionally naked, I continued. "The amendment does something very simple. If I die under suspicious conditions or become legally controlled through coercive filings, Daniel does not inherit direct authority over my business, real estate, or primary accounts. Those interests move into a protective foundation and Noah's discretionary trust." That cracked the room. Daniel stared at me in open shock. Mara's hand clamped around her water glass so hard I thought it might break. Vale looked furious now, not cautious. Richard remained still 2 seconds longer than the rest, which told me his mind had gone directly to loss calculation. "No," Mara said first. "That can't be right." Lydia opened the file and slid the relevant page across the table. "It is." Richard did not reach for it. That mattered. He already believed me enough to know touching paper would only confirm the terms he was now trying to recalculate around. Daniel finally found his voice. "You changed Mom's will against me?" "I didn't change anything," I said. "Your mother did, because she was afraid of you." His face collapsed in a way I will remember longer than I want. "Dad, don't." The word cut the table clean. "Do not call me that," while sitting beside the woman who helped prepare incapacity papers for me and the doctor who mailed sedatives to my house after forging concern. Vale straightened. "I will not sit here and let grief distort." "Then stand up and leave," I said. "But if you leave before I finish, Lydia sends every page Eleanor preserved, every lab result, every prescription discrepancy, and every surveillance record to the board before sunrise." That shut him up. Richard finally smiled again, but smaller now. "You've become dramatic." "No," I said. "I've become informed." Then I reached beneath the file and placed the college photograph on the table between the wine glasses. Eleanor and Richard at 22, her hand on his sleeve, his hunger plain enough that even the younger version of me should have seen it if I had been less flattered by friendship later. Richard's eyes dropped to it once and came back to me. Mara looked confused. Daniel looked sick. Vale looked bored in the way cowards do when emotion outside their lane threatens to delay money. I said, "Would you like me to explain why my wife kept this with your shell company transfers, Richard? Or would you like to try?" He laughed softly. And there it was. The old confidence returning, because he thought emotion might still be a terrain he could manage better than the rest of us. "Arthur," he said, "if this evening is about some ancient college jealousy, then grief has done more damage than even they feared." He nodded toward Lydia and the file. Noted, useful, cruel. I let the insult pass. "Then let's keep it contemporary," I said. I placed the forged transfer beside the photo, then one still frame from the lamp camera Aaron had recovered, then the lab result on the sedatives, then finally the message transcript from the intruder's phone. Do it clean. Before the estate meeting, Mara went white enough that lipstick became separate from the rest of her face. Vale said, "This is absurd." Richard still had not touched any paper. Daniel looked at the text and whispered, "No." That surprised me. Not because he had not suspected danger, because he had apparently not known it had crossed into contract killing. Interesting, very. I leaned toward him. "That surprises you?" He looked at me as if he had aged 10 years in 1 minute. "I knew he said things," Daniel whispered. "I didn't know." He stopped. Richard turned his head very slowly toward him. And there, at last, was the first beautiful sound of the evening. Fear changing ownership. I said nothing. Silence does more work than accusation once the right person starts drowning in it. Mara broke next. "This is exactly why I told you we should have finished the filings before he found anything." She said it to Richard, not to me. Beautiful. Richard shut his eyes for one brief second, not from guilt, from irritation, the way a conductor might react if his second violin forgot the score and started screaming from the wrong bar. "You are speaking too quickly," he said. Mara snapped back. "No, you are. Every time. You keep thinking because you waited 30 years you're still the smartest person in every room." There, obsessive motive now public inside the circle. Daniel looked from one to the other. 30 years? Richard did not answer him. Instead, he asked me, very calmly, how much of Eleanor's material has law enforcement already seen? That question told Clara everything she needed. Warren later said he nearly laughed upstairs when he heard it through the feed. I smiled for the first time all evening. More than enough. And that was when the room stopped being a family dinner and became an internal collapse. You could feel the table decide, almost physically, that it was no longer one thing. Until then, the evening had still been pretending to be family. Bad family, tense family, manipulative family, but still recognizably arranged around shared language and a common interest in avoiding public flame. After that line, it became factions, not moral factions, survival factions. Richard understood it first. Of course he did. His hand, still resting lightly beside his plate, closed once and relaxed. He glanced toward the hallway in a way so quick most people would have missed it. Not looking for an exit, calculating witnesses, counting doors. A man who has always thought in positional control does not panic visibly when the room turns. He starts gaming which version of failure still leaves him tallest among the wreckage. Mara understood it second, and in some ways more dangerously. Operators who are suddenly unshielded become vicious because they know exactly how much of the practical grime can now be assigned to them by the architect. All her careful warmth vanished. The face underneath it was harder and younger and frankly meaner than anything she had shown in my house before. Not glamorous, not composed, just irritated at being made into labor for a man whose obsession now threatened to leave her holding all the wet end of the wire. Vale understood it third and worst. Cowards tied to professional identity always believe they can still float above ordinary guilt if they keep using the right nouns. He was not thinking about Eleanor. Not then. He was thinking about board review, prescribing pattern, audit trails, pharmacy pulls. How many times he had signed under language that sounded medically defensible until sequence stripped the jargon off it. Daniel understood it last because Daniel had spent years outsourcing clarity to stronger people whenever clarity threatened to cost him a life he still wanted to keep. That was the shape of the room. Richard calculating, Mara stripping varnish, Vale sweating professionally. Daniel finally catching up to the scale of the machine he helped oil. I let the silence hold. This is the part people misunderstand when they later ask how I kept calm. They imagine calm is some noble thing. It is not. It is often just exhaustion with edges. I had spent a year missing my wife and weeks learning how many of my own habits had been used as openings. By the time we reached that table, I no longer needed the emotional satisfaction of shouting. Shouting would have given them something familiar to organize against. Silence made them arrange themselves. Mara was the first to realize Richard might sacrifice her. She looked at the message transcript again, then at the forged transfer, then at Richard. "You said he'd sign before it ever got ugly," she said. "Interesting. Not I never agreed to this. Not I didn't know. He'd sign." Richard did not answer directly. "You're spiraling." "No," she snapped. "I'm calculating prison." That startled Vale enough that he knocked his water glass with the heel of his hand. It did not spill, but the sound cracked the moment cleanly. I said, "That thought finally got into the room, did it?" Vale rounded on me with a suddenness that made his mask slip a full inch. "You have no understanding of what chronic caregiving strain does to perception." Another magnificent sentence, a liar's cathedral built out of sterile words. "Were you her doctor?" I asked, "or hers?" I nodded toward Richard. Vale's mouth tightened. Richard said, "Stephen, don't." That told me more than any admission could have. Not because he protected Vale, because he protected sequence. He still believed one disciplined room could survive if he controlled which subordinate spoke in what order. Mara heard it too. "Oh, now you're worried about sequence," she said. "How many times did I tell you not to make him part of the medical side? Him, not Vale." "Richard." Daniel looked from her to the doctor and back again. "You told me Mom needed oversight," he said to Vale. "You told me if she got another opinion we'd destroy her confidence and she'd stop treatment entirely." Vale actually had the nerve to shrug. "Patients like your mother confuse skepticism with self-protection." The sentence hit the table like acid. Patients like your mother. My wife had become a type in his mouth, a category, a problem set. There is a special hatred reserved for hearing the dead person you loved translated into professional annoyance by the man who helped harm her. I said, "Say her name." Vale blinked. "What?" "Say her name if you intend to discuss her at my table." He looked away. "Couldn't do it. That pleased me more than it should have. Mara seized the opening. He won't, she said, because then he'd have to remember she was a person when he started adjusting doses to buy you time. She pointed not at Vale, at Richard again. There it was, the line of authority, finally visible enough for even Daniel. Richard gave her a flat look, one he had probably used for years to remind subordinates that emotional deviation had consequences. You are saying too much. And you spent too long saying too little, she shot back. That is why we're here. Daniel stood then, not fully, half risen, like a man whose body has decided before his pride whether he is staying. I watched his hands, still trembling. Richard saw it too and changed tactics with the speed of a man who has run human weather systems longer than most people hold jobs. Daniel, he said quietly, sit down. Your father wants spectacle because grief has made him susceptible to pattern seeking. Don't feed that. It would have worked once, maybe for years it had. Authority disguised as rescue, contempt disguised as composure. But now Daniel had two things he lacked before. Public witnesses he could not control, and evidence that Richard had moved beyond fraud into murder without telling him. That second one mattered most. Whatever rotted in my son, he had still wanted to believe there were levels Richard would not cross. Men can survive participating in theft longer than they can survive understanding they stood beside open homicide and kept calling it strategy. I'm not feeding anything, Daniel said. I'm hearing things in order for the first time. Richard's smile almost returned. That would be easier to believe if you weren't reacting exactly when your father needs you to. A sharp line, designed to push Daniel back into boyhood, to make shame feel childish, reactive, manipulable. For 1 second I thought it might work. Then Mara, of all people, saved the fracture by saying, "Oh, stop treating him like a son you built. You only ever liked him because debt made him moldable." I do not know whether she meant to save him. Probably not. She was saving herself. That is often enough. Daniel turned slowly toward her. Moldable. She realized too late she had said the quiet part in a room that no longer protected quiet parts. You know what I mean? No, he said. I know exactly what you mean. I want to hear you say it. She looked at Richard. He looked back at her with nothing usable in his face. That was the moment she understood she had already been left alone. So she went ugly. Fine, she said. You were weak. You needed things translated. He translated them. I operationalized them. Stephen softened the medical terrain, and if your mother had stopped digging when any reasonable woman would have, none of this would have needed to escalate. Reasonable woman. That line nearly lifted me out of my chair. Not because it shocked me, because it named the contempt underneath everything. Reasonable women do not check signatures, do not compare dosages, do not ask why a family friend keeps arriving before ambulances, do not notice old legal vocabulary in new wives, do not build rooms inside walls, do not survive their own suspicions long enough to inconvenience the extraction. Eleanor had been unreasonable in exactly the way decent lives depend on. Daniel stared at Mara as if seeing not just her but the entire shared language of their marriage stripped down to wiring. You're saying Mom had to die because she kept asking questions. Mara rolled her eyes with open disgust now. I am saying women like your mother think observation is a virtue even when it destroys timing. Silence. Then even Vale said, very quietly, Mara. Not from conscience, from tactical horror. Too late, I looked at Richard. He still had not denied anything. That was important. A man still thinking an outcome does not waste breath contradicting subordinates if he thinks he can later frame them as unstable. He lets them overtalk, then tries to retrieve himself as the only precise one left standing. So I denied him that path. Richard, I said, did you love my wife? The question cut through every other line in the room. Daniel stared at him. Mara actually laughed under her breath. Vale looked offended on Richard's behalf, which remains one of the stranger loyalties I have ever witnessed. Richard did not answer immediately. That too was answer. I respected her, he said finally. No, he met my eyes. Then what exactly is the question? The question, I said, is whether everything else at this table was just your preferred way of punishing the life she chose after she did not choose you. There are men who break loudly. Richard broke by growing still. Not frozen, still. As if some deep old private nerve had finally been touched by someone he no longer believed had the right. When he spoke, his voice was softer than before. You think this is about romance? I think this is about entitlement stretched over 30 years until it learned to wear suits. He smiled then, but not well. You had safety, he said. That was always your one qualification. There it was. Not a full confession. Better. Vanity abandoning caution because contempt still needed expression. Daniel whispered, Jesus. Mara sat back in her chair slowly, watching Richard as if recalculating the man she had attached her fortunes to. Vale closed his eyes for one brief second, perhaps finally seeing just how thoroughly the moral center of the scheme had rotted long before he monetized it. And upstairs, behind the office glass, Warren later told me the team shifted all at once because the room had finally crossed the line from circumstantial collapse into self-authored ruin. Daniel stood first, not to attack, not to leave, to get farther from Richard. "You said nobody would get hurt," he told him. Richard looked almost tired now. "Daniel, sit down." "No, sit down." For a second I saw the old hierarchy in pure form. Not friendship, not mentorship, not business. Command. Daniel did not sit. Mara did something I had not expected. She laughed, not pleasantly, not sanely. The laugh of a person who has spent years building her own justifications only to discover she was never more than a useful employee in another person's obsession. "Oh, now you order him?" she said. "Now, after using him as collateral for half a decade?" Vale muttered. "Stop talking." She turned on him instantly. "Don't you dare. You build half those scripts through wellness codes and still act like this is somehow beneath you." Another beautiful crack. I said quietly, "Scripts." Vale's face changed. Too late. Daniel stared at the doctor. "You altered her meds?" Vale snapped. "Your mother was difficult." He meant suspicious. He meant observant. He meant unmanageable. Lydia did not even bother hiding the satisfaction on her face as she wrote that down. Richard tried once more to retake the room. "Everyone needs to be careful," he said. "Arthur has staged a moral theater because he wants one answer to explain several messy realities." "Then explain one reality cleanly," I said. "Why was my wife documenting shell entities tied to your loans and Vale's trust contacts while her hair fell out and cameras appeared in my house?" He answered too smoothly. "Because Eleanor became paranoid." That word hung there. Then Daniel said very softly, "No, she didn't." All of us looked at him. He was breathing hard now, eyes wet but not with the right kind of sorrow. Not grief, fear of his own overdue honesty. "Mom wasn't paranoid," he said. "She started seeing things exactly because they were there." Richard's voice lost patience. "Daniel. No, you don't get to tell me how to do this anymore." That sentence might have saved whatever was left of him, or maybe it merely made the rest undeniable. He looked at me and then away again, as if direct eye contact with his father still cost too much. "I knew about the money moves," he said. "At first. Not all of them, but the first ones. Richard said it was temporary and would balance before quarter close. Then it didn't. Then there were personal notes. Then Mara said if I admitted the debt in the wrong order, you'd shut me out and Mom would push charges." I did not interrupt. He went on. "When Mom got sick, no, before that, she started asking too much. Mara kept saying questions create paper trails and paper trails destroy families. Then Vale said stress was making her irrational, and Richard said we needed to manage timing until he could unwind things." Manage timing. Their language was so revealing once no one bothered cleaning it. "Did you know they were poisoning her?" I asked. Daniel's eyes closed. I knew Vale changed things without telling her. I told myself it was for anxiety. Then I stopped asking because every answer led to a bigger thing, and every bigger thing made me more trapped. "Coward's truth." "But truth," Mara sneered. "You stopped asking because you liked still having a future." He turned on her with a look I had not seen in him since adolescence. "And what did you like?" She opened her mouth, shut it, then said the truest line she had all night. "Survival." There are moments when morality clarifies less through innocence than through hierarchy. At that table I could suddenly see the pecking order cleanly. Richard wanted Eleanor because he had never stopped wanting what she denied him, and never forgave the life she built elsewhere. Mara wanted extraction, money, position, security through controlled vulnerability. Vale wanted debt relief, cash, and the narcotic authority of being treated as medically untouchable. Daniel wanted a route through his own disgrace that did not require losing everything at once. Everyone had found their own justification. That is how systems like theirs survive, not through one shared motive, through compatible selfishness. I placed one final item on the table, Richard's old letter. I read the relevant line aloud. "You chose a safe man because safe men are easier to manage." No one spoke. Then I looked at Richard and asked the question I had wanted to ask since opening the safe. "When Eleanor said my name at the end, were you there?" Mara jerked her head toward him. Vale stared at the table. Daniel went gray. Richard did not answer at first. Then he smiled. Small, broken somewhere in the middle now. "Does it matter?" Yes, there it was. Not a courtroom confession. Better. A man choosing contempt over denial because vanity finally outweighed caution. I stood. "So you were." He did not deny it. Instead he said, "She had decades to admit she made the wrong choice. She never did." Mara whispered, "My God." Maybe that was for the first time she understood she had not been helping a fraud scheme with emotional residue. She had been helping a very patient man avenge a personal rejection by emptying an entire family out from the inside. Richard looked around the room as if only now recognizing that his audience no longer belonged to him. Then he said the stupidest thing any guilty man can say when too many frightened accomplices are present. None of you would have had any of this without me. Daniel laughed once in disbelief. No, he said, we'd have had our lives. That was the moment Clara gave the signal. The pantry door opened, then the front hall. Then two plainclothes officers entered with Halloran and Clara behind them. No dramatic weapons drawn, no shouting, just authority arriving at the exact second private cruelty lost the power to rename itself. Mara stood so fast her chair toppled backward. Vale blanched and said, I want counsel. Richard stayed seated. Daniel sat down again like his bones had quit. Clara laid the arrest warrants on the table one by one. Richard Hale for conspiracy, fraud, attempted murder solicitation, and related charges pending homicide review. Dr. Stephen Vale for medical fraud, unlawful prescribing, conspiracy, and evidentiary homicide expansion. Mara Bennett, because that was not originally her real surname either, for coercive fraud, surveillance conspiracy, attempted unlawful control, and related financial offenses. Daniel Barrett for fraud and conspiracy with charging discretion noted, pending cooperation. That last line made him look at me. Not for rescue. Just because fathers remain the final witness men crave when their excuses collapse. I did not nod. I did not turn away. I simply let him see my face. He started to cry then, quietly, like a man ashamed even of that. Richard rose only when Halloran touched his sleeve. He looked at me once more. I loved her longer than you did. That was what he chose as his final sentence to me. Not innocence, not regret, not even anger. Possession. I answered the only way truth permitted. No, you wanted her longer than you knew how to love anyone. For the first time all night, his face emptied completely. Then they took him out through my front door. Vale protested process. Mara demanded language. Daniel said nothing at all. After the cars were gone and the blue strobe stopped staining my curtains, the house became very quiet. Lydia closed the file. Warren came down from upstairs. Clara asked if I could manage a few more questions or needed a medic because my blood pressure had probably climbed into the sort of territory decent men fear and guilty doctors exploit. I said I was fine. I was not fine. I was simply still standing. There is a difference. The part no one tells you about revenge is how administrative the morning after feels. Forms, statements, property inventories, evidence transfer receipts, medication chain reviews, passwords needing reset, locks needing changed. A list on Lydia's yellow pad so long it looked like the house itself had become a document. Clara returned at 8 with a victim services coordinator, 2 more investigators, and a warrant team for Richard's office and Vale's clinic. Denise camped at my dining table with 3 laptops, a printer, and the expression of a woman who considered financial fraud a personal insult to arithmetic. By noon, we had frozen 4 linked accounts, flagged 2 trust structures, and identified enough shell movement that one federal liaison started asking whether Richard's appetite for covert control had crossed state tax lines too. Warren left only once to retrieve something from evidence lockup. When he came back, he handed me a small envelope. Inside was Noah's drawing from my living room camera archive. He had made it in my house 2 months earlier while Mara supervised a visit. Crude house, blue boat in the yard, 3 stick figures. Above them, in a child's uncertain print, Grandpa, don't be sad. I sat with that piece of paper for a long time, because even while adults turned my grief into infrastructure, a child had still been trying to repair me in crayon. Noah came the next day. That required planning, not because I feared him, because children deserve careful truth when adults have already used lies to reshape the walls around them. He arrived with a child specialist from the state and Lydia beside him, as if they together could make the room less likely to hurt him by accident. He was 9 now, old enough to see tension, young enough to still ask direct questions. Is Dad in trouble? He asked before taking his coat off. Yes, I said. Is he bad? He did bad things. Did he kill Grandma? The room paused. Children sometimes go directly to the wound adults orbit for months. I don't know exactly what he knew, I told him. I know Grandma was hurt by people who lied. Your dad helped them in ways he should not have, but he also let them control him. Adults can do both. He thought about that longer than some grown men would have. Then he asked, Is that why Mom said not to talk too much in your house? Yes. I said yes. The child specialist later told me that simple truth, delivered without speechifying, probably mattered more than any attempt to rescue his feelings from pain. Pain had already happened. What children need after that is clean language and adults who stop treating reality like something that should be managed for convenience. Noah stayed the weekend. He slept in the room Daniel had once slept in as a boy. He ate too much cereal. He asked whether the police cars had sirens on when they took Richard away. He wanted to know if doctors can go to jail and if jails let people keep belts. He built a fort out of sofa cushions and insisted I sit inside it with him because it's harder to be attacked if you have walls. That line nearly broke me. Children reveal what they have been taught to fear, by the architecture they invent in play. On Sunday evening, he stood in Eleanor's office doorway while Warren and Aaron photographed the hidden chamber one final time for evidentiary preservation. "Why would Grandma build that?" he asked. I looked at the empty wall. "Because she knew the truth before I did." He absorbed that, then nodded like a small judge. Grandma was usually faster. She was. The exhumation findings came 2 weeks later. Not dramatic enough for television. More devastating than television. A pattern of toxic exposure consistent with gradual administration over time, aggravated by conflicting prescription decisions no ethical physician would make in combination. Not certainty by itself, coupled with Vale's records and the lab history enough. Enough for the homicide review to become homicide. Daniel requested a proffer session before arraignment. He asked for me. Lydia told me not to go. Clara said going might help. Warren said it would be the most honest misery I ever sat through. All three were right. The meeting took place in a dull conference room with one clock and too much stale coffee. My son looked terrible. Jail had removed whatever remained of Richard's protective myth around him. Without that pressure, he looked less like a conspirator and more like what he had probably been for years underneath the worst of it. A weak man who kept yielding to stronger evil because every previous yield made the next one feel structurally unavoidable. He talked for 4 hours, about debt, about shame, about how good Richard had been at making rescue feel conditional but righteous, about how Mara translated fear into forms, about how Vale always had a medical phrase ready to make unease seem clinical and delay seem responsible, about how Eleanor's questions became intolerable because she was the only one still speaking like reality existed outside strategy. He admitted he had known the cameras were installed, known the first transfer was wrong, known the petition would humiliate me, and told himself it was temporary. Known Vale changed Eleanor's medication in ways he should have challenged. He denied knowing Richard had moved from fraud to murder until too late. I believed him partly. That is the hardest category of truth. The part a father can neither fully trust nor fully dismiss. Near the end, he said, I kept waiting for one thing to happen that would force me to stop. Something big enough that I could finally admit I was trapped too. I asked him the question that had lived in me since the night he warned me not to make things public. And when it did happen, he looked down. You had to come save me from my own decisions before I could. That sentence will probably live with me until I die. Not because it absolved him, because it was accurate. The state offered him a cooperation deal substantially lighter than what Mara and Vale faced. Lydia asked whether I objected. I said no. That surprised even me. Not because I forgave him, because punishment and restoration are not always the same question, and Noah still deserved a father who might one day become someone better than the man he had helped imprison himself into being. Richard refused every deal. Of course he did. Men like him mistake unbroken vanity for dignity all the way to sentencing. The trial did not begin for 9 months. In that time, the house changed more than I did, though I changed plenty. I replaced every lock, removed every light fixture Mara had ever complimented, sold the dining room table, and bought a new one because I could not keep eating on a surface where so many people had calmly discussed my erasure. Had the office restored, but not rebuilt exactly. The hidden chamber remained behind secured access through court order until the criminal case closed, and then I had it photographed one last time and sealed in plain sight rather than concealed. If secrecy had protected the truth once, I wanted visibility to protect it after. Noah came most weekends. Daniel wrote letters from county holding. At first I did not answer. Then one afternoon Noah asked if people in jail still get mail when they make everyone hate them. That is a child's way of asking whether love has a legal cutoff. So I answered one letter. Not tenderly, not cruelly. I told Daniel I would not lie for him, excuse him, or rebuild him by force. I told him if he wanted any future in my life or Noah's, he would have to become a man who could describe what he had done without reaching for easier adjectives. No crisis language, no trapped language, no Richard made me language. Influence matters, choice remains, learn to hold both. He wrote back shorter after that, more honestly too. Mara went to trial brittle and furious. Vale went pale and procedural. Richard looked almost refreshed by it. That last part angered me more than anything. Because some men take the public spectacle of their own destruction as proof of scale, as though infamy were just the negative image of greatness. Richard entered the courtroom each day like a man attending a negotiation he still might win if everyone else became tired enough. He did not count on Clara Wynne, or on Denise's ledgers, or Lydia's timelines, or Warren's recovery of the surveillance map, or Aaron's authenticated audio, or Daniel, who sat through 2 full days of testimony and then, under oath and under visible shame, described exactly how Richard built dependency around debt and how Mara and Vale operationalized it. Most of all, Richard did not count on Eleanor. Her journal, her recorder, her careful dates, and the clauses in her will accomplished what the living often fail to do under fear. She preserved sequence. Sequence is what sinks liars. Not one ugly fact. The order, question, drug change, transfer, camera, petition, threat, brake line, syringe, estate timing. By the second week of trial, the defense stopped trying to argue that nothing had happened and began trying to argue that too many things had happened at once for any one person to own them all. That is also a kind of confession. Richard testified in his own defense. I had hoped he would. Men with disciplined vanity often cannot resist the chance to narrate themselves. He was clever. I will give him that. He framed himself as an over-involved friend trying to preserve a business after my grief made me vulnerable and Daniel's debt made him unstable. He painted Mara as overzealous, Vale as sloppy, Daniel as weak, and Eleanor as understandably suspicious in decline. Then Clara stood for cross-examination and asked one question at a time until she had peeled every layer of rhetoric off him in public. Had he or had he not loaned Daniel the money personally before routing parts of it through company-facing structures? Yes. Had he or had he not helped introduce Vale to the family after those debts were already in place? Yes. Had he or had he not received copies of my account activity through business oversight channels? Yes. Had he or had he not entered my home the day Eleanor died before emergency personnel arrived? Yes, because Daniel called him first. A lie. The call records later corrected him, but the yes was already there. Had he ever written Eleanor after she married me saying she chose safety over truth? He tried not to answer. The letter answered for him. And finally, had he or had he not said at my dinner table, on recorded audio, that none of them would have had any of it without him? He looked at Clara for a long time before saying, "Context matters." And Clara answered, "It does. That is why we are still here." The jury convicted on the major counts. Not all of them. Trials are messier than rage wants, but enough. Conspiracy, fraud, solicitation related to the intruder, coercive surveillance, medical exploitation through coordinated conduct, homicide linkage under the Vale findings and conspiratorial support theory. Vale lost his license before sentencing. Mara cried at hers and then cursed Clara under her breath loud enough for the deputy to hear. Daniel stood when his reduced sentence was read and thanked no one. Richard listened to his sentence with his hands folded as though he were reviewing a disappointing annual report. When the judge finished, he turned and looked at me across the courtroom. No apology, no regret, only the final shriveled form of the same old belief. If he had wanted my life long enough, then some portion of it had belonged to him. He was wrong. But obsession does not learn at sentencing what love could not teach in youth. After court, reporters waited outside. I said nothing. Lydia spoke for the family in one clean statement. This case was about fraud disguised as care, control disguised as family, and one woman's insistence on leaving a trail of truth strong enough to survive her. That was enough. The real ending did not happen at the courthouse anyway. It happened the following spring, on a Saturday morning, with a pry bar in my hand. The court had finally released the hidden room structure from evidentiary hold. Aaron and Warren came over with tools. Noah wore old sneakers and asked too many questions. I told him doors come off one screw at a time, like most bad systems. We removed the false paneling first, then the shelf, then the stool, then the safe mount. Finally, we stood looking at the narrow chamber itself, empty now except for dust, screw holes, and the memory of how much life had been rearranged around it. Noah asked if we were going to keep it. No, I said. Why not? Because some spaces teach the wrong lesson by surviving. Instead, I had the wall rebuilt open and honest, with shelves from floor to ceiling, books, manuals, Eleanor's green ceramic bowl, no hidden compartments, no false boards, no second room. Noah helped me place the first object back on the shelf, not the safe, not the recorder. One framed photo of Eleanor in the garden, sun in her hair, looking at something beyond the camera with the expression she always wore when she had already understood a problem before the rest of us finished describing it. "That's a good one," Noah said. "Yes," I told him. She usually was. A year after the arrests, the house sounded different. That is not poetry. It is acoustics. No hidden devices humming, no guests arriving with managed concern, no footsteps in the hall that made every room feel temporarily supervised. Just the ordinary sound of an old house near water, pipes ticking, floorboards settling, kettle whistling, wind taking the corner of the porch screen at the same time every evening. Daniel was in a minimum security facility by then, working through the kind of state-ordered programs that do not redeem anyone by themselves, but at least force men to hear their choices in unsoftened language. We wrote monthly, sparse letters, better than none. Noah visited twice, always with the specialist Lydia recommended, and came home quieter but not shattered, which I counted as progress. I no longer believed in clean endings. I believed in workable mornings. Workable mornings turned out to matter more. Noah at the kitchen table drawing tugboats too large for their docks. My business running smaller but cleaner after Denise helped me unwind every poisoned contract Richard had touched. Lydia dropping by unannounced with legal updates and insulting my coffee. Warren pretending not to like the chowder I made and eating 3 bowls anyway. And sometimes, on the best evenings, Eleanor's office with the window open and the rebuilt shelves holding exactly what they claimed to hold. One Sunday near the start of summer, Noah spread his pencils across the kitchen table and announced he was making the new version of the house. He drew for almost an hour with complete seriousness. I was at the stove oversalting tomato sauce because Eleanor always claimed I cooked as if flavor were a dare. Outside the windows, the lilacs had gone over and the sky still held light past 8. The whole evening was so ordinary it almost hurt. When Noah finally finished, he held the page up to me. In the drawing there was the house, the porch, a rebuilt office window, the shop sign for Barrett Marine Supply. 3 figures in front. One was small and missing proportional sense around the arms, which meant it was supposed to be him. One was me. The third, taller and a little uncertain at the shoulders, was his father, drawn from recent visits and hope in roughly equal measure. Above the house he had written, in careful block letters, "No more secret rooms." I looked at that page for a long time. Then I set the spoon down and turned away under the excuse of checking the sauce, because sometimes love, grief, fury, and relief all arrive so close together the body mistakes them for an inconvenience and needs a second before speaking. Noah asked, "Do you like it?" "Yes," I said, "very much." He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his pencils. That is the image I keep now. Not the arrest, not the trial, not Richard being led out in handcuffs. Not Mara finally hearing a judge say the word predatory out loud. Not Vale's license stripped. Not even the safe opening in the dust behind Eleanor's wall. This one. A kitchen lit from inside. A child drawing a future large enough to fit the truth. A rebuilt office. And a house where every room says exactly what it is. For a long time, I thought the opposite of betrayal was justice. I was wrong. Justice matters. It matters a great deal. But it is still public, still procedural. Still something other people announce in your presence. The opposite of betrayal is return. Return to your own name. Return to ordinary mornings. Return to language that does not need soft words to hide sharp intentions. Return, if you are very lucky, to a table where no one is taking notes on how to empty your life while pretending to protect it. Eleanor gave me that return by leaving a trail strong enough to survive her. My son almost lost his forever. A clever woman with borrowed surnames tried to turn my grief into paperwork. A doctor sold his license in slow doses. A friend mistook possession for love and patience for destiny. They all lost. Not because I was smarter than them, because my wife was. And because 1 year after she died, a leak behind her office wall finally forced me to open what grief had kept shut. That is the whole truth as I know how to tell it, and it is enough.